I'll never forget the moment my entire family's faces turned to stone. For 6 months, I sat alone in that hospital room, holding Grandpa's hand while he took his final breaths. Where was everyone else at the bank? Fighting like vultures over his $12 million. They didn't even show up to say goodbye. They called me weak, pathetic. Playing the martyr, they sneered. But then the bank called. Formal clarification meeting, they said. All heirs must attend. My cousins arrived in designer suits, already spending money that wasn't theirs. The bank director opened a sealed envelope, Grandpa's final will, and read it aloud. The room went dead silent. Interesting, she said, looking up. None of you are listed here. I watched their faces drain of colour. Watched their $1 million dreams shatter in real time. Because what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Grandpa had been planning this for 3 years. And he'd left me something far more powerful than money. He'd left me the truth, and a choice that would change everything. My name is Caroline Knight, and I'm 35 years old. I'm a certified public accountant, and for the past 8 years, I've managed the finances for a non-profit organisation that provides housing assistance to low-income families. It's not glamorous work, but it's meaningful, and I'm good at it. I live alone in a modest 2-bedroom apartment across Town Drive, a 10-year-old Toyota, and have never asked my family for a single dollar. But none of that has ever impressed them. To my cousins, Brandon, Madison, and Trevor, I'm just boring Caroline, the one who does paperwork, while they chase bigger, flashier dreams. Right now, though, none of them are here. I'm the only one sitting in this dim hospital room at 2 a.m, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor and watching my grandfather's chest rise and fall in shallow, laboured breaths. Grandpa James is 82 years old and his heart is giving out. End-stage heart failure, the doctors call it. For the past 6 months, I've been his sole caregiver, managing his medications, coordinating with hospice nurses, sleeping on the uncomfortable cot they set up in the corner of his room. I've cancelled plans, taken family leave from work, and rearranged my entire life to be here. And where is everyone else at the bank, apparently, or on the phone with estate lawyers, or having urgent family meetings that somehow never include me? Brandon is 40 now, the oldest of us cousins, and the self-appointed family success story. He runs a real estate development company that looked impressive on paper 5 years ago, but has been hemorrhaging money ever since. He still drives the Mercedes and wears the expensive suits, but I've seen the worry lines deepening around his eyes. Madison, 38, owns a chain of day spas that she's always describing as luxury wellness destinations. What she doesn't mention is that 3 of the 5 locations are barely breaking even, and she's been quietly closing bank accounts to cover payroll. Then there's Trevor, 42, the lawyer who was supposed to be the family's legal genius. Last I heard, he was facing ethics complaints from the state bar, something about mishandling client funds, though he's never admitted the details to any of us. They're all so loud, so confident, so certain the world revolves around their ambitions. And Grandpa, bless his heart, helped every single one of them over the years. He sold his manufacturing company 10 years ago for a considerable sum, and ever since they've been circling like hawks asking for loans to expand the business or invest in a can't-miss opportunity. He gave and gave and gave. And when the money ran low and his health started failing, they still kept asking. Earlier this evening, I'd stepped out of Grandpa's room to get a cup of coffee from the vending machine down the hall. That's when I heard them. Brandon, Madison, and Trevor standing in the corridor, near the elevators, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. I froze just around the corner, the coffee forgotten in my hand. That 12 million needs to be split equally, Brandon was saying, his voice tight with tension. I don't care what anyone thinks they deserve. We divide it 5 ways, clean and simple. Agreed, Madison said quickly. No one gets more than their share. We handle this like adults. Trevor's voice was cooler, more calculated. We just need to make sure there aren't any surprises in the will. I'll talk to the estate attorney tomorrow. Not once did any of them ask how Grandpa was doing. Not once did they mention his name, except in the context of what he was leaving behind. I stood there in that hallway, my hands shaking, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. They weren't here because they loved him. They were here because they were waiting for him to die. I walked back into Grandpa's room, set the coffee down on the side table, and pulled my chair close to his bed. His eyes were closed, his breathing ragged and uneven. I reached for the damp cloth on the bedside tray and gently wiped his forehead, smoothing back the thin white hair that had once been thick and dark. His eyes fluttered open just barely, and he looked at me with a clarity that startled me. His hand, frail and spotted with age, reached for mine. His grip was weak, but his voice, though barely a whisper, carried a weight I'll never forget. "Don't trust anyone in this house," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Not one of them." His words hung in the air between us, and I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that surely there was some misunderstanding, but the conversation I just overheard in the hallway made that impossible. Instead, I squeezed his hand gently and nodded, letting him know I'd heard him. He took a shallow breath, his eyes focusing on my face with an intensity I hadn't seen in weeks. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice still barely above a whisper, but clearer now, as if he'd been saving his strength for this moment. "Don't accept injustice just because they can't see your value. Being kind doesn't mean staying silent when you're disrespected." I blinked back tears, surprised by how deeply those words cut through the exhaustion and hurt I'd been carrying. For 6 months, I told myself that what I was doing didn't need recognition, that caring for Grandpa was its own reward. But hearing him acknowledge what no one else had even noticed made something crack open inside me. "I see you, Caroline," he continued, his fingers trembling slightly in mine. "I've always seen you. You're the only one who came because you love me, not because you want something from me." I couldn't speak. I just held his hand and let the tears fall silently down my cheeks. Grandpa shifted slightly against his pillows, wincing with the effort. "I need to tell you something about your cousins, about what happened to this family." He paused, gathering his breath. 10 years ago, when I sold the company, everything changed. Before that sale, when the business was struggling, when I was working 70-hour weeks just to keep the doors open, do you know who called to check on me? No one. Not Brandon, not Madison, not Trevor. They were too busy with their own lives. He closed his eyes for a moment, and I thought he might drift off, but then he continued. "But the day the sale went through, the day the money hit my account, suddenly I had 3 very attentive grandchildren. Brandon needed startup capital. Madison wanted to expand. Trevor had investment opportunities. People forget who stood by them when things were hard. They only remember who can give them more." The bitterness in his voice was something I'd never heard before. Grandpa had always been so gentle, so generous, always making excuses for everyone's behaviour. Hearing him speak this truth felt like watching a dam break. "I gave them what they asked for," he said. "I wanted to believe they'd use it wisely, that they'd prove me wrong. But money doesn't change people, Caroline. It just reveals who they've always been." He reached toward the bedside table with his free hand fumbling weakly at the drawer. I stood and opened it for him, and he gestured toward a yellowed envelope tucked beneath a box of tissues. Next to it was a small brass key on a plain metal ring. "Take those," he said. "Hide them. Don't let anyone see." I pulled out the envelope and key, their weight, solid and real, in my palm. The envelope was sealed, my name written across the front in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. The key was old, tarnished around the edges, the kind that might open a desk drawer or a small lockbox. 3 things matter most, Grandpa said, watching me carefully as I slipped both items into the pocket of my cardigan. "That envelope, that key, and your patience. Don't open the envelope until you see who they really are. You'll know when the time comes. And the key will make sense when you need it to. I wanted to ask him what he meant, what the envelope contained, what the key unlocked, but something in his expression stopped me. This wasn't the time for questions. This was the time to trust him. "Promise me," he said, his grip on my hand tightening with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't open that envelope until you've seen their true nature with your own eyes. Not just heard about it, not just suspected it, seen it." "I promise," I whispered. He relaxed slightly, sinking back into the pillows. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said something that seemed completely random. "You know, I installed security cameras throughout the house years ago. Had them put in every room, every hallway. People thought I was paranoid about burglars, but that wasn't it at all." He smiled faintly. "I just wanted to remember the beautiful moments. Birthdays, holidays, family dinners. I wanted to capture the memories while I still could." At the time, it seemed like the wandering thought of a tired, sick man. I nodded and smiled, assuming his mind was drifting the way it sometimes did when he was exhausted. "Rest now, Grandpa," I said softly, adjusting his blanket. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." His eyes were already closing, his breathing evening out into the shallow rhythm of sleep. I settled back into my chair, my hand still holding his, and felt the outline of the envelope and key pressing against my ribs through the thin fabric of my cardigan. I stared at them for a long moment, turning the key over in my fingers. It was small, unremarkable, the kind of thing you might find in a junk drawer and not think twice about. But Grandpa had kept it in his bedside table, had made sure to give it to me specifically, had told me it would make sense. Just when I needed it to. What did it open? And what was in that envelope that I wasn't supposed to read until I saw my cousin's true nature? I held the brass key up to the dim light filtering in from the hallway, watching it catch and gleam. Grandpa's breathing had deepened into sleep, his face finally peaceful after the effort of our conversation. I tucked the key back into my pocket next to the envelope and leaned back in my chair, my mind racing despite my exhaustion. Whatever Grandpa had planned, whatever he wanted me to know, I would honour his wishes. I would wait, I would watch, and when the time came, I would be ready. The next 3 weeks blurred together in a haze of medication schedules, hospice nurse visits, and the relentless rhythm of keeping another human being comfortable as his body slowly gave up. I'd moved into Grandpa's house completely, now sleeping in the guest room down the hall from his bedroom, keeping my phone on the loudest setting in case he needed me during the night. My carefully maintained care journal had grown thick with entries, each page documenting his vitals, his medication times, what little he'd managed to eat, the moments when he'd been lucid enough to talk. 847 consecutive days, I realised one morning as I flipped back through the pages. More than 2 years of my life devoted to making sure he wasn't alone. Meanwhile, my cousins had developed their own routine, though it had nothing to do with Grandpa's care. Every morning, like clockwork, one of them would announce they had errands to run and disappear for 2 or 3 hours. It took me less than a week to figure out where they were going. Brandon let it slip first, complaining to Madison about the traffic on Maple Street. Maple Street was where First National Bank had its main branch, the one where Grandpa had done his banking for 40 years. I started paying closer attention after that. Trevor would leave right after breakfast, dressed in one of his expensive suits, carrying his leather briefcase, as if he were heading to court. He'd return looking irritated, muttering about bureaucratic nonsense and privacy laws. Madison would go in the afternoons, always bringing back a coffee from the shop next to the bank, as if that would camouflage where she'd really been. And Brandon would make his visits in the evening, timing them for right before the bank closed, probably hoping to catch the manager before they left for the day. None of them ever asked if I wanted to come along. None of them ever asked if I needed anything from town. And not one of them ever came back and went straight to Grandpa's room to check on him. I kept my observations to myself and focused on what mattered. Grandpa's comfort, his dignity, making sure that in these final weeks, he felt loved and cared for. I measured out his medications with precision, kept detailed notes for the hospice nurses, adjusted his pillows when he shifted uncomfortably, read to him from his favourite books when he was awake enough to listen. I did all of this quietly without fanfare because it was what he needed, because he was my grandfather and I loved him. It was that simple. But my cousins didn't see it that way. I discovered that one afternoon when I was in the kitchen preparing Grandpa's lunch and overheard Brandon and Madison talking in the living room. They must have thought I was upstairs because their voices weren't even lowered. "Caroline's waiting for her piece too," Brandon said, his tone dripping with cynicism. "Don't think she's so innocent. Why else would she be here day and night? She's positioning herself." "I don't know," Madison replied, though she didn't sound convinced. "She's never asked Grandpa for anything, not like us." "That's exactly my point," Brandon shot back. "She's playing the long game, being the devoted caregiver, so he feels guilty and leaves her more. It's manipulative if you ask me." I stood frozen at the kitchen counter, the sandwich I was making forgotten in my hands. Was that really what they thought? That everything I'd done for the past 2 years was some calculated strategy to get money? Later that evening, I heard Trevor on the phone in the den, his voice carrying through the house. I was coming down the stairs with Grandpa's dinner tray when his words stopped me cold. 12 million divided by 5 people, that's 2.4 million each, he was saying, clearly running numbers for whoever was on the other end. But I bet the old man has more than that tucked away. That manufacturing company sale was worth at least 15 million after taxes. Where did the rest go? We need to make sure we're not leaving anything on the table. I continued down the stairs as quietly as I could, my heart pounding. This wasn't grief. This wasn't concern for their dying grandfather. This was a business transaction. They were calculating their shares like investors waiting for stock to mature. The worst moment came 2 days later. I'd taken Grandpa's bedding down to the laundry room in the basement, and when I came back up, I heard Madison on her phone in the hallway outside Grandpa's room. She was speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. "The lawyer said if Dad dies without a new will, everything splits equally by law," she was saying. 5 ways clean and simple. We just need to make sure he doesn't change anything now. He's barely conscious most of the time anyway, so it's not like he's thinking clearly enough to make legal decisions. There was a pause, then she laughed softly. "No, Caroline won't be a problem. She doesn't even know how much money is involved. Just tell Emma her dad will pick her up later. Okay, Brandon's stuck at the bank again." Emma. I'd heard that name before. Brandon's daughter. I'd never met her, never even seen a photo. Just one more family member who'd been kept separate from the caregiving, from the reality of what was happening here. I waited until Madison walked away before I went back into Grandpa's room. He was sleeping, his breathing shallow and laboured. I sat down in my usual chair and pulled out my care journal, recording his vitals with mechanical precision. But my hand was shaking. That night, after I'd gotten Grandpa settled and the hospice nurse had finished her evening check, I went to the kitchen to make myself some tea. The house was quiet, everyone supposedly in their rooms. I was heading back upstairs when I noticed a light on in Grandpa's home office at the end of the first floor hallway. That was strange. No one used that room anymore. Grandpa hadn't been in there in over a year. I moved quietly down the hallway, my socked feet silent on the hardwood floor. The office door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see someone moving around inside. I recognized the silhouette immediately. Trevor was at Grandpa's desk, opening drawers, rifling through papers. He moved quickly but carefully photographing documents with his phone, then putting everything back exactly as he'd found it. He was looking for something specific, and he clearly didn't want anyone to know he'd been there. I stood in the darkened hallway watching my cousin search through my dying grandfather's private office and felt the envelope and key in my pocket like weights pulling me down. Grandpa's words echoed in my mind. "Don't open that envelope until you see who they really are." I was seeing it now, clear as day. I didn't confront Trevor that night. I simply backed away from the office door, returned to my room, and sat on the edge of the bed with my hands folded in my lap, feeling the outline of the envelope and key through my cardigan pocket. Grandpa had told me to wait to see their true nature with my own eyes, and I had. There was no point in accusing Trevor of snooping. It wouldn't change anything. It would only alert them that I was paying attention. The next 4 days passed in a kind of suspended tension. Grandpa's breathing grew more laboured, the spaces between each breath stretching longer. The hospice nurse started coming twice a day instead of once, her expression growing more sombre each time she checked his vitals. She told me gently that we were in the final stage now, that it could be hours or days, but not much longer. I didn't leave his side. I pulled my chair close to his bed, held his hand and talked to him softly about everything and nothing. I told him about the garden outside his window, how the roses he'd planted were starting to bloom. I reminded him of the time he taught me to ride a bike running alongside me down the driveway until I found my balance. I thanked him for every kindness, every moment of love he'd shown me throughout my life. My cousins drifted in and out of the house during those days, but they rarely came into Grandpa's room. When they did, they stood awkwardly near the door, glancing at their phones, making vague comments about how peaceful he looked before finding an excuse to leave. It happened at 3:17 in the morning on a Thursday. I'd been dozing in my chair when something shifted in the room, a change in the quality of the silence. I opened my eyes and saw that Grandpa's were open too, looking directly at me. His breathing had changed, each inhale a struggle, each exhale, like he was letting go of something precious. I moved to the edge of my chair and took his hand in both of mine. "I'm here, Grandpa," I whispered. "I'm right here with you." His fingers tightened around mine with surprising strength, and his lips moved. I leaned closer, my ear near his mouth, straining to hear. The words came out broken, barely more than breath, but I caught each one. Draw, third, camera, truth. Then his grip relaxed. His chest rose one more time and fell, and didn't rise again. The heart monitor's steady beep flattened into a single, continuous tone. I sat there holding his hand, tears streaming down my face, and felt the exact moment his presence left the room. The hospice nurse came in within minutes, having been sleeping in the downstairs guest room. She checked for a pulse, turned off the monitor, and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she said quietly. "He's at peace now." I nodded, unable to speak, and stayed with him for another hour. I wasn't ready to let go yet. I wasn't ready for what came next. I called my cousins at 4:30 in the morning. 3 brief, identical conversations. "Grandpa passed away. I thought you should know. Brandon said he'd be there as soon as possible." Madison asked if the hospice nurse had filled out the death certificate. Trevor said he'd make some calls and hung up. They arrived at 9:30, a full 6 hours later. I'd been sitting in the living room, numb and exhausted, still wearing the same clothes I'd had on when Grandpa died. They walked in together, and I waited for the tears, the grief, the acknowledgement that we'd just lost someone irreplaceable. Instead, Brandon looked around the room and said, "Where are the property documents? We need to start going through Dad's files." Madison was already walking through the house with her phone out, photographing furniture artwork, the china cabinet in the dining room. "Just for insurance purposes," she said when she caught me staring. "We need to document everything." Trevor went straight to Grandpa's office. I heard drawers opening, file cabinets being searched. No one had even asked to see Grandpa's body. No one had asked me if I was okay. I stood up slowly, my body aching from exhaustion and grief, and walked to the stairs. I needed to get away from them, needed a moment to breathe. But as I reached for the banister, Madison's voice cut through the air. "Caroline, what's that in your pocket?" I froze. She was staring at the yellowed envelope, a corner of which had slipped partially out of my cardigan pocket. "What did Dad give you?" She crossed the room quickly, her hand outstretched. "Hand it over. All of Dad's property needs to be inventoried. That includes papers." I pulled the envelope and key fully out of my pocket and held them against my chest. "Grandpa gave these to me. They're personal." "Nothing is personal right now," Brandon said, moving to stand beside Madison. Everything in this house is part of the estate. We need full transparency. I'm not giving you these, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Trevor emerged from the office, his expression sharp. Caroline, don't make this difficult. We're all beneficiaries of Dad's estate. Anything he gave you before his death could affect the distribution of assets. As a lawyer, I'm telling you that withholding potential estate documents is legally problematic. From now on, this house is joint family property, Brandon announced, his voice taking on a tone of authority I'd never heard him use before. Caroline, you need to hand over all keys and documents. We'll handle Dad's affairs properly through the appropriate legal channels. I looked at the three of them standing united against me and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. This was what Grandpa had warned me about. This was why he told me to wait to see who they really were. No, I said quietly. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Madison's face flushed red. Brandon's jaw clenched. Trevor's eyes narrowed. I turned and walked up the stairs to the guest room, locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart pounding. I could hear their voices rising in the living room below, angry and accusatory, but I didn't care anymore. With shaking hands, I sat on the bed and carefully opened the yellowed envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. I recognised it immediately, the same careful script he'd used to write letters and birthday cards all my life. The words at the top made my breath catch. My dear girl, let them show their true nature before you do the last thing I've asked of you. The key will unlock everything. I read the letter 3 times, my hand steadying with each pass. Grandpa's words were clear, deliberate, and they confirmed everything I'd witnessed over the past few weeks. He'd known exactly what would happen after his death. He'd prepared for it, and he'd trusted me to see it through, whatever it turned out to be. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope along with the brass key, and tucked both into my purse. Then I gathered my few belongings from the guest room, walked downstairs past my cousins who were still arguing in the living room, and left Grandpa's house without a word. I drove back to my apartment in a daze, my mind cycling between grief for Grandpa and disbelief at how quickly my cousins had revealed themselves. The attack started the next morning. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon at 7 a.m. We need those documents, Caroline. Stop being difficult. This is family business. By 8, Madison had left 3 voicemails, each one more urgent than the last. You're making this so much harder than it needs to be. Just give us what Dad gave you and we can all move forward. Trevor's approach was more calculated. He sent a formal email late that afternoon with the subject line, "Legal notice regarding estate documents." The message was filled with phrases like potential misappropriation of estate property and fiduciary responsibility to all beneficiaries, and concluded with a thinly veiled threat about pursuing appropriate legal remedies if necessary. I didn't respond to any of them. What could I possibly say that Grandpa had warned me not to trust them, that he'd given me something important but told me to wait before acting on it? They wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, it would only make them more desperate to get their hands on whatever Grandpa had left me. The rumours started by the end of the week. A friend from my non-profit called, her voice careful and concerned. Caroline, I heard something strange today. Someone said you'd manipulated your grandfather into changing his will while he was dying. I told them that was ridiculous, but I thought you should know people are talking. Madison. It had to be Madison. She moved in social circles that overlapped with mine, attended the same charity events, knew the same people. And now she was poisoning those connections, painting me as some kind of opportunistic villain who'd taken advantage of a dying man. I sat in my apartment that night staring at my phone as another string of accusatory texts came through, and wondered if I was strong enough for whatever Grandpa had asked of me. The isolation was crushing. My cousins, the only family I had left, had turned against me completely. My professional reputation was being attacked by whispers and insinuations I couldn't directly confront. And I had no idea what Grandpa's plan actually was, or how long I was supposed to endure this. I thought about just giving them the envelope and key. Maybe that would end it. Maybe I was misunderstanding what Grandpa wanted. Maybe the path of least resistance was the right one after all. But every time I reached for the envelope, I remembered Grandpa's words. Don't trust anyone in this house. Not one of them. And I remembered watching Trevor search through Grandpa's office, hearing Brandon calculate inheritance splits, before Grandpa had even died, seeing Madison photograph valuables while Grandpa's body was still warm. On the 8th day after Grandpa's death, I finally worked up the courage to visit his longtime attorney, Mr. Harrison. His office was downtown in one of those old buildings with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that made everything feel serious and permanent. The receptionist showed me into a conference room where Mr. Harrison was waiting, a tall man in his 70s, with kind eyes and an air of professional discretion. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Caroline," he said, shaking my hand. "James was a good man and a good client for over 30 years. I thanked him and took a seat across from him at the polished conference table. "I need to ask you about Grandpa's will. My cousins are saying everything should be split equally, but Grandpa gave me something before he died, and I'm not sure what it means or what I'm supposed to do." Mr. Harrison folded his hands on the table and sighed. "I'll be honest with you. I wasn't authorized to create any new will for your grandfather. The last official will I have on file is from 15 years ago. And yes, it does split everything equally among all 5 of you. You, Brandon, Madison, Trevor, and your Aunt Susan's share goes to her children." My heart sank. So that was it then. Whatever Grandpa had given me, it didn't matter legally. The old will would stand, and my cousins would get exactly what they'd been calculating all along. I stood to leave, feeling defeated and foolish for thinking Grandpa could have changed anything. But as I reached the conference room door, Mr. Harrison's voice stopped in me. "Caroline, wait." His tone had changed, become quieter, almost conspiratorial. I turned back to face him. He glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. "Your grandfather did mention something to me about 3 years ago. We were having lunch, just catching up, and he said something odd. He told me he'd arranged everything in a safer place. I asked him what he meant, whether he wanted me to draft a new will, but he refused. Said he had his reasons for keeping certain things private, even from his attorney." "Did he say where?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "Or what he meant by safer place?" Miss Harrison shook his head slowly. "He wouldn't tell me, but he seemed very pleased with himself, like he'd solved a problem that had been troubling him. And he asked me a strange question that day. He asked if documents held by a bank would have the same legal weight as documents held by an attorney, assuming they were properly notarized and witnessed." I felt the weight of the brass key in my purse. A bank. Grandpa had been talking about a bank. I told him it depends on the circumstances, but generally yes, Mr. Harrison continued. If he had something notarized and witnessed according to state law, the location of storage wouldn't necessarily affect its validity. That's all I know, Caroline. I wish I could tell you more. I thanked him and left his office, my mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but I still didn't understand the complete picture. What had Grandpa stored at a bank? What did the brass key open? And why all the secrecy? I was sitting in my car in the parking garage, still trying to process everything Mr. Harrison had told me when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter or nosy acquaintance who'd heard Madison's rumours, but something made me pick up. "Ms. Knight," a woman's voice professional and measured. "This is Eleanor Chen from First National Bank. I'm calling regarding your grandfather, James Knight's estate. We need to meet with you urgently. Would you be able to come to the bank today?" I agreed to meet Mrs. Chen at 3 o'clock that afternoon, which gave me just enough time to go home, change into something more professional than the jeans and sweater I'd worn to Mr. Harrison's office, and try to calm my nerves. The brass key felt heavy in my jacket pocket as I drove to First National Bank, and I kept one hand pressed against it as if I could draw strength from the physical connection to Grandpa. The bank was an imposing brick building on Main Street. the kind of old-fashioned institution that had been serving the community for generations. I'd been here once or twice with Grandpa years ago, back when I was a teenager, and he was teaching me about savings accounts and compound interest. The marble floors and high ceilings had seemed grand and intimidating then. They felt even more so now. A young woman at the information desk directed me to the third floor, to a conference room reserved for private client meetings. As I stepped off the elevator, I could hear raised voices coming from down the hall. My stomach tightened with apprehension. I followed the sound and stopped just outside the conference room door, which stood slightly ajar. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Brandon was saying, his voice sharp with frustration. "We've been coming here every day for 2 weeks. You keep saying you need authorization, you need documentation, you need clearance. From who the man is dead." "I understand your frustration, Mr. Knight," a calm female voice responded, "but I have very specific instructions that must be followed to the letter." I pushed the door open and walked in. The conference room was spacious with a long table surrounded by leather chairs and a wall of windows overlooking the street. Brandon, Madison and Trevor were seated on one side of the table, all the three of them turning to stare at me as I entered. Their expressions ranged from surprise to immediate hostility. "Of course," Madison said, her voice dripping with accusation. "Of course you're involved in this." At the head of the table sat an elegant Asian woman in her 50s wearing a navy suit and pearl earrings. She stood and extended her hand to me. "Ms. Knight, I'm Eleanor Chen, Director of Estate Services. Thank you for coming on such short notice." I shook her hand, trying to ignore the daggers my cousins were shooting at me with their eyes, and took the empty seat across from them. Mrs. Chen returned to her position at the head of the table and opened a leather portfolio in front of her. "Now that everyone is here, we can begin," she said. "I've asked you all to come today because your grandfather, James Knight, deposited a sealed document package with our bank 3 years ago. The instructions attached to this package were very specific. It was to remain locked in our most secure vault until his passing, at which point all named beneficiaries were to be gathered for the opening." "What kind of documents?" Trevor asked his lawyer, instincts immediately engaged. "And why weren't we informed of this arrangement when it was made?" Mr. Knight requested complete confidentiality. Mrs. Chen replied evenly, "As to the contents, I don't know. The package is sealed, but I can tell you that it was properly notarized and witnessed according to state law." Brandon leaned forward, his face flushed with barely controlled anger. "This is her doing," he said, jabbing a finger in my direction. "Caroline manipulated Dad into this. She was with him constantly those last few months, probably whispering in his ear, convincing him to cut us out." "That's not true," I said quietly, but my voice was drowned out by Madison's rising hysteria. "You've been planning this all along, haven't you?" She was nearly shouting now, tears streaming down her face. "Playing the devoted caregiver, making yourself indispensable, all so you could steal what's rightfully ours." "Please," Mrs. Chen said firmly, her calm authority cutting through the chaos. "I need everyone to remain civil. These accusations are premature and inappropriate." Trevor had been silent, watching me with cold calculation. "What did Dad give you, Caroline? I know he gave you something. You've been hiding it since he died." All eyes turned to me, and I felt my face grow hot. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass key, setting it on the table between us. The afternoon sunlight caught the tarnished metal, making it gleam dully. "He gave me this," I said, "the day before he died. He told me to wait, that I'd understand when the time came." Mrs. Chen's expression shifted, something like satisfaction crossing her face. She reached into a drawer in the credenza behind her and produced an identical brass key. "To open the safety deposit vault, where your grandfather's package is stored, we need 2 keys. One has been held by the bank in a separate, secure location. The other was given to the designated heir by Mr. Knight himself. Without both keys present, the vault cannot be opened." The silence that followed was absolute. My cousins stared at the 2 keys, then at me, their expressions a mixture of shock, fury, and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "Before we proceed to the vault," Mrs. Chen said, picking up a sealed envelope from her portfolio, "I need to read Mr. Knight's letter of instruction. He was very clear that this must be read aloud to all beneficiaries before anything else happens." Mrs. Chen carefully broke the wax seal on the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of heavy cream stationery. I recognized the paper immediately. Grandpa had used that same stationery for important correspondence his entire life, each sheet embossed with his initials in the corner. Seeing it now, knowing these were his final instructions, made my throat tighten with emotion. "This letter is dated March 15th, 3 years ago." Mrs. Chen began adjusting her reading glasses. "It reads, 'To my dear family, if you're hearing this letter, then I've passed on. I'm sorry for all the secrecy, but I needed to do this carefully, in a way that would protect what matters most. I know this situation is confusing and probably upsetting. I ask that you hear me out completely. What's in the vault will clarify everything, but first there are some formalities we need to observe." My cousins shifted in their seats. Brandon's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. Madison had stopped crying and was staring at the letter with an expression I couldn't quite read. Trevor had pulled out his phone and appeared to be taking notes, his lawyer brain already working on how to challenge whatever was coming. Mrs. Chen continued reading. "The package in the vault can only be opened with 2 keys working in tandem. Eleanor Chen, whom I trust completely, holds 1 key on behalf of the bank. The other key I have given to my granddaughter Caroline, who has proven herself to be the most trustworthy person in my life." She paused, glancing up at us. "Before we can proceed to the vault, there's one additional security measure. The designated heir must provide a signature that matches the sample Mr. Knight placed on file 3 years ago." She slid a piece of paper and pen across the table to me. "Ms. Knight, if you would please sign your full name here." My hand was shaking slightly as I picked up the pen. I was aware of everyone watching me could feel the weight of their attention, like a physical pressure. I signed my name carefully, Caroline Elizabeth Knight. The same signature I'd been using since I was 16, when I'd practiced for hours to get the loops and curves just right. Mrs. Chen picked up the paper and walked to a file cabinet in the corner of the room. She unlocked it, removed a sealed plastic sleeve, and held the 2 signatures side by side. After a moment, she nodded. "Perfect match. The signature is verified." "Wait," Brandon said, his voice sharp. "How did he have her signature from 3 years ago? What did he ask her to sign something? And she didn't even know what she was signing." "I assure you, everything was done properly," Mrs. Chen said, returning to her seat. "Mr. Knight provided a reference signature during the initial setup of this arrangement. The circumstances of how he obtained it are not relevant to these proceedings." But I knew. 3 years ago, Grandpa had asked me to witness his signature on some banking documents. "Standard procedure," he'd said. I'd signed as a witness without thinking twice about it. He'd been planning this for 3 years, and I'd had no idea. Mrs. Chen picked up the letter again. "There's more. Mr. Knight left additional documentation for context." She opened a leather-bound notebook, the kind Grandpa had always used to keep meticulous records of everything from business expenses to garden plantings. "This is a visitor log your grandfather maintained during his various health challenges over the past 5 years. He was quite thorough." She turned the pages slowly, showing us Grandpa's careful handwriting. 2000 through 20, multiple hospitalizations for heart issues. Visitor log shows no family visits during any of these stays. 2023 to 25, intensive home care required. Visitor log shows one name, Caroline Knight, appearing consistently for 847 consecutive days. The room went completely silent. I stared at that number. 847 days. More than 2 years of my life documented in Grandpa's careful script. Proof of every morning I'd arrived at his house, every night I'd stayed late, every holiday I'd spent by his bedside instead of doing anything else. Madison's face crumpled, and she started crying again, but this time it looked different, more calculated. "We wanted to visit," she said, her voice breaking. "We just didn't know how bad it was. No one told us." "I sent emails every week updating everyone on his condition," I said quietly. "Not one of you ever responded." Trevor ignored me, his attention fixed on Mrs. Chen. "That journal isn't a legal document. It's just an old man's personal notes. It doesn't prove anything about intent or capacity." Mrs. Chen's expression remained neutral, but her voice took on a slight edge. Mr. Knight's mental capacity was evaluated by the 3 independent physicians at the time he made these arrangements. All 3 certified him as being of sound mind. Those evaluations are part of the sealed package. She set the journal aside and picked up the letter again. "Before we proceed to the vault, Mr. Knight left a question he wanted each of you to answer honestly. I'll read it exactly as he wrote it. In the past 5 years, when I was sick and struggling, who among you spent time caring for me not because you expected something in return, not because of money or inheritance, but simply because you loved me and wanted me to know I wasn't alone?" The silence that followed was excruciating. I watched my cousins waiting for one of them to speak, to offer some explanation or justification, but none of them said a word. They just sat there trapped by a question they couldn't answer honestly without condemning themselves. Finally, Mrs. Chen closed the letter and folded her hands on top of it. "Now we'll proceed to the vault," she said. "But Mr. Knight included one more condition before the contents can be revealed." Mrs. Chen reached into her portfolio and pulled out another document, this one clipped together with several pages. "Mr. Knight's final condition is this: any person wishing to claim inheritance from his estate must provide evidence that they acted out of love for him, not financial motivation. To that end, I'm authorized to ask each of you a direct question." She turned to Brandon first. "Mr. Knight, in the 6 months before your grandfather's death, did you call or visit him without mentioning money loans or financial matters?" Brandon's face went from pale to red. "That's not a fair question. Dad and I had a business relationship. We talked about investments opportunities. That's how we connected." "I'll take that as a no," Mrs. Chen said, making a note on her paper. She turned to Madison. "Ms. Knight, same question. In those final 6 months, did you visit or call your grandfather purely out of concern for his well-being?" "I sent him a card on his birthday," Madison said defensively, "and I called several times. I was worried about him." "But did those calls include requests for financial assistance?" Mrs. Chen asked. Madison's silence was answer enough. Trevor straightened in his chair, preparing his defense before Mrs. Chen even asked. "I'm an attorney. My grandfather consulted me on legal matters. Of course, our conversations included financial and estate topics. That doesn't mean I didn't care about him." Mrs. Chen nodded and set down her pen. "Mr. Knight anticipated these responses. He asked me to share something with you." She opened a folder and pulled out several printed pages. "These are copies of text messages your grandfather sent to each of you over the past 2 years. I'll read a few examples." She adjusted her glasses. "September 2023. To Trevor kids, I'm very lonely these days. The house feels so empty. Could someone visit this week? November 2023 to Madison. Would love to hear from you, sweetheart. It's been months since we talked. February 2024 to Brandon. I know everyone is busy, but I miss my family. Could we have dinner together soon?" She looked up from the pages. None of these messages received responses. Not one. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. I'd known my cousins rarely visited, but seeing the evidence laid out like this, seeing Grandpa's loneliness documented in his own words, was almost unbearable. "We were busy," Trevor said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "We had demanding careers, families of our own. We couldn't just drop everything." Caroline managed to, Mrs. Chen said simply, while maintaining her own career. Madison suddenly turned on me, her grief transforming into rage. This is such bullshit. She bought his affection. Don't you see what she did? She manipulated a sick, lonely old man, made herself indispensable, and now she's trying to steal everything from us. She's the most manipulative person here. I opened my mouth to respond, but Mrs. Chen held up her hand. I have additional documentation that addresses that accusation. She pulled out 3 photocopied checks, each one dated from different years. These are checks Mr. Knight attempted to give Caroline over a 2-year period, $10,000 each. All 3 were refused. She laid them on the table where everyone could see. There, in my own handwriting on the memo line of each check, were nearly identical messages. I just want to be with you, Grandpa. I don't need anything. On one of them, I'd written, your company is worth more than money. The room fell silent again. I'd forgotten about those checks, forgotten the conversations where Grandpa had tried to pay me for my caregiving, and I'd refused every time. It hadn't been about money then, and it wasn't about money now. It had only ever been about him. A knock on the conference room door broke the tension. Mrs. Chen stood and opened it to admit a distinguished-looking man in his 60s carrying a leather briefcase. He had silver hair and the measured demeanour of someone who spent his life dealing with serious legal matters. Apologies for the delay, he said, shaking Mrs. Chen's hand before turning to address the rest of us. I'm Jonathan Miller from Miller & Associates. I was Mr. James Knight's personal attorney for over 20 years. He set his briefcase on the table and opened it, pulling out a thick folder. 3 years ago, I was asked by Mr. Knight to notarize certain documents related to his estate. I did so in the presence of 2 independent witnesses, neither of whom were family members or beneficiaries. Everything was conducted according to proper legal protocol. Trevor leaned forward. Why weren't we informed as potential beneficiaries we had a right to know about changes to the estate plan? Mr. Knight was under no legal obligation to inform anyone of his private arrangements, Mr. Miller replied. He was of sound mind as certified by multiple physicians whose evaluations I have here. He had every right to structure his estate as he saw fit. He nodded to Mrs. Chen, who stood and gestured for all of us to follow her. We'll now proceed to the vault. We walked through the bank in silence, taking an elevator down to the basement level. The vault area was behind multiple security doors, each requiring Mrs. Chen to input codes and use her security credentials. Finally, we reached a small room containing a large safety deposit box, vault built into the wall. Mrs. Chen inserted her key into the left lock. She looked at me and held out her hand. Miss Knight, if you would. I pulled out Grandpa's brass key and inserted it into the right lock. Together, we turned both keys simultaneously. There was a heavy click, and the vault door swung open. Inside was a large metal box. Mrs. Chen carefully removed it and set it on a table in the centre of the room. She opened the lid, revealing 3 large manila envelopes, inside each one carefully labelled in Grandpa's handwriting. The first envelope read, Envelope 1, the truth. The second, Envelope 2, the money. The third, Envelope 3, the final wish. Mrs. Chen looked at each of us in turn, her expression grave. Mr. Knight requested these envelopes be opened in order in the presence of all beneficiaries. Shall we begin? 2 weeks had passed since that first meeting at the vault, 2 weeks during which my cousins had oscillated between threatening me with the lawyers and trying to convince me to be reasonable and share whatever was in those envelopes before the official opening. I'd refused all contact, and now we were back in the same conference room, the 3 manila envelopes sitting in the centre of the table like unexploded bombs. Mrs. Chen had called us all individually to schedule this meeting, explaining that Mr. Knight's instructions required a 2-week waiting period between the initial vault opening and the revelation of contents. He wanted everyone to have time to reflect, she'd said. I suspected Grandpa had wanted time for my cousins to show their true colours even further, and they hadn't disappointed. Trevor had sent 3 more threatening emails. Madison had tried to turn up at my apartment. Brandon had actually hired a private investigator to follow me, as if I might lead him to some hidden cache of Grandpa's money. Now we sat in silence as Mrs. Chen carefully opened the first envelope, the one labelled The Truth. She pulled out a thick bound document, at least 50 pages, with tabs separating different sections. This is a comprehensive investigation report compiled by Sentinel Private Investigations over a 3-year period, Mrs. Chen said, her voice taking on a more formal tone. Mr. Knight hired them to gather factual information about each family member's financial situation and activities. Everything in this report was obtained legally and can be verified through public records and documented observations. She opened to the first tabbed section. Brandon Knight. The investigation reveals total debt of $2.3 million accumulated through failed real estate investments, primarily in luxury condo developments that never broke ground. 3 properties currently in pre-foreclosure. Multiple creditors pursuing collection. Brandon's face went from red to white in seconds. "How dare you?" he whispered. "That's private financial information." "It's public record," Attorney Miller interjected calmly. "Court filings are accessible to anyone." Mrs. Chen turned to the next section. Madison Knight, investigation documents gambling losses, totaling approximately $800,000 over a 2-year period at various casinos in Atlantic City and Las Vegas. Additionally, evidence of 3 spas operating at a loss with payroll being covered by taking cash advances on personal credit cards. Madison's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Tears were already streaming down her face, but these weren't the calculated tears from before. These were tears of humiliation and exposure. Trevor Knight, Mrs. Chen continued, moving to the 3rd section. Currently under investigation by the State Bar Association for misappropriation of client trust funds. 3 formal complaints filed. Investigation ongoing with potential disbarment proceedings pending. Trevor stood up abruptly. "This is character assassination. My grandfather had no right to investigate us like criminals. He had every right to know the truth about people who were constantly asking him for money." I said, my voice stronger than I expected. It was the first time I'd spoken directly to any of them since we'd gathered. Mrs. Chen set down the report. "There's one more item in this envelope. Mr. Knight included video footage from his home security system." She pulled out a tablet and set it on the table, angling it so everyone could see the screen. "This footage is from September the 12th, 2 years ago. It was recorded in Mr. Knight's living room by his legally installed security cameras." She pressed play, and suddenly I was looking at Grandpa's living room, the familiar furniture and family photos in the background. Brandon and Trevor were sitting on the couch, both holding glasses of what looked like whiskey. The timestamp in the corner showed it was late evening. Brandon's voice came through clearly. "So, how much longer do you think the old man's going to live? His doctor said his heart could give out any time." Trevor swelled his drink. "Could be months, could be years, but we need to be prepared either way. That money should be ours. We're his only grandchildren, or at least the only ones who matter." "What about Caroline?" Brandon asked. Trevor laughed, a cold sound that made my stomach turn. "Please, she's a nobody, a CPA making 40 grand a year working for some charity. If he leaves anything to her, we'll contest it. No court is going to side with her over us." "Agreed," Brandon said, raising his glass. "Here's to family loyalty." Mrs. Chen paused the video. The silence in the conference room was absolute and terrible. I felt like I couldn't breathe. This was what Grandpa had heard, what he'd watched alone in his bedroom while my cousin sat in his living room drinking his whiskey and planning how to cut me out. Madison was the first to break the silence, but instead of apologizing or showing remorse, she turned her rage on Trevor. "You were planning to sue Caroline, to contest the will. What about the money you borrowed from Dad last year? $50,000 for business expenses. that you never paid back. Trevor's composure cracked. Don't talk to me about borrowed money. You took $30,000 from the family emergency fund to cover your gambling debts. You thought no one noticed. But I saw the withdrawal records when I was helping Dad with his taxes. At least I didn't forge his signature, Madison shot back, and both of them turned to look at Brandon. I don't know what you're talking about, Brandon said, but his voice was weak. The loan application from 2 years ago, Trevor said, his lawyer instincts taking over even in his anger. For $500,000. Dad's signature was on it, but I always suspected it wasn't real. Did you forge it, Brandon, Mrs.? Chen cleared her throat quietly. That particular allegation is addressed in envelope 2, which will open shortly. But before we proceed, she looked at me, and I saw something in her expression that made my chest tighten. Ms. Knight, you asked whether your grandfather heard this conversation himself. I hadn't realised I'd been crying until I felt the tears dripping off my chin. Did he? I managed to ask. Mrs. Chen's professional composure wavered for just a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was rough with emotion. Mr. Knight came to my office the day after this conversation took place. He brought his laptop and played this footage for me, and he... She paused, collecting herself. He cried. I'd known James Knight for 15 years, and I'd never seen him cry. He said, Eleanor, I worked my whole life to give them security to make sure they'd be taken care of. And this is what they think of me. This is who they've become. The weight of those words settled over the room like a physical force. I looked at my cousins and saw them exactly as Grandpa must have seen them, not as the grandchildren he'd loved and supported, but as strangers wearing familiar faces, people who'd let greed replace love so completely that they couldn't even see the transformation. And it broke his heart, I whispered. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. Yes, it broke his heart. Mrs. Chen allowed a moment of silence to pass, letting Grandpa's heartbreak settle over us like a shroud. Then she reached back into envelope 1 and pulled out another document, this one with an official-looking seal at the bottom. Brandon Knight, I need to address the loan application Trevor mentioned, she said, her voice returning to its professional tone. 2 years ago, First National Bank received a loan application for $500,000 purportedly signed by James Knight. The loan was denied due to irregularities in the documentation, but the application remained in our files. She laid the document on the table where we could all see it. Grandpa's signature was clearly visible at the bottom, that distinctive backward slant on the K in Knight that I'd seen on birthday cards and Christmas checks my whole life. After Mr. Knight hired the private investigators, he specifically asked them to examine this signature. Mr. Chen continued. The bank engaged a certified forensic document examiner, someone who testifies in court cases involving questioned documents. Their analysis was conclusive. She placed a second report next to the loan application. This signature is a forgery. The actual person who signed this document was identified through pressure point analysis, pen, angle measurement, and comparison to known handwriting samples as Brandon Knight. Brandon shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. That's insane. I would never. Dad must have asked me to sign for him because his hands were shaking. That's not forgery, that's helping an elderly man with paperwork. The loan application lists your grandfather as the borrower, Attorney Miller said quietly. If he'd authorised you to sign on his behalf, proper documentation would have been required. A power of attorney at minimum. The bank has no record of any such authorisation. This is a setup, Brandon said, but the panic in his eyes gave him away. Caroline probably put Dad up to this, convinced him I was trying to steal from him. Before anyone could respond, there was a knock at the conference room door. Mrs. Chen stood and opened it, admitting a man in his 40s wearing a dark suit and carrying a badge clipped to his belt. He had the measured, observant demeanour of someone who dealt with unpleasant situations for a living. This is Detective James Morrison from the Financial Crimes Unit, Mrs. Chen said. Per banking fraud protocol, we were required to notify law enforcement when the forgery was confirmed. Detective Morrison has been coordinating with our legal department on this matter. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was criminal. Detective Morrison stepped into the room, his gaze settling on Brandon. Mr. Knight, I'm going to need to ask you some questions about this loan application. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. He is an attorney, Madison practically shrieked, pointing at Trevor. Tell them this is ridiculous. But Trevor had gone very quiet, his face ashen. He wasn't even looking at Brandon. He was staring at the table, and I realized he was calculating his own exposure, wondering what else might be in those envelopes. Detective Morrison finished reading Brandon his Miranda rights and asked, "Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you?" Brandon nodded mutely. All the bluster had drained out of him. He looked smaller, somehow diminished. "I'm going to need you to come down to the station to make a formal statement," Detective Morrison said. "You're not under arrest at this time, but I strongly advise you to cooperate fully with our investigation." Madison seized on this moment, desperate to deflect attention from her own situation. "You want to investigate financial crimes? Look at Trevor. He's been stealing from his own clients. The State Bar has multiple complaints against him for misappropriating trust funds. That's actual theft, not some paperwork mix-up." Trevor's head snapped up, fury blazing in his eyes. "You want to talk about theft, Madison? How about the time you tried to get power of attorney over Dad when he was in the hospital? You forged documents claiming he was incompetent so you could access his accounts. The only reason it didn't work is because the judge threw out your petition when Dad's doctor testified he was perfectly lucid." "That's a lie," Madison shouted, but the way her voice cracked told me it wasn't. "I have the court records," Trevor shot back. "You tried to have our grandfather declared mentally incompetent so you could control his money. And when that didn't work, you came to me asking if there was another way to access his accounts without his permission." They were tearing each other apart, all the family loyalty evaporating under the pressure of exposure. I sat there watching, feeling like I was witnessing something that should never have been seen, the complete dissolution of whatever bonds had once held us together. "And what about you, Brandon?" Trevor continued, his voice rising. "What about the $300,000 Dad gave you 5 years ago? He thought it was for Emma's college fund. He wanted to make sure his great-granddaughter had her education secured. But you gambled it away, trying to save your failing business, didn't you? Emma doesn't have a college fund. She doesn't have anything because you pissed it all away." Brandon's face crumpled. "I was going to pay it back. I had deals in the pipeline." "You had nothing," Trevor said coldly. "You've had nothing for years. You're a failure propping up a facade with other people's money." Detective Morrison had been taking notes through all of this, his expression professionally neutral but his pen moving quickly. "I'm going to need all of you to remain available for questioning," he said. "These allegations raise serious concerns that will require thorough investigation." I couldn't take it anymore. The accusations, the rage, the complete implosion of anything resembling a family, it was too much. I looked at Mrs. Chen, my voice barely steady. "What's in envelope 2, the $12 million everyone's been fighting over? Because that's what this had all been about, wasn't it? Not love, not family, not honouring Grandpa's memory. Just money. Always money. The $12 million that had turned my cousins into strangers, that had poisoned every interaction since Grandpa got sick, that had made them forget what actually mattered." Mrs. Chen met my eyes, and I saw something almost like sympathy in her expression. "That's exactly what we need to discuss next," she said quietly, "because the $12 million is not what any of you think it is." 3 weeks had passed since that explosive meeting. 3 weeks during which I'd barely slept, replaying the video footage and my cousins' accusations against each other over and over in my mind. Mrs. Chen had insisted on another waiting period before opening envelope 2, explaining that Mr. Knight's instructions specified these intervals to allow proper reflection and understanding. I suspected Grandpa wanted us to sit with the truth, of envelope one to really absorb what it revealed about who we'd all become. Now we were back in the same conference room, though the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Brandon sat slumped in his chair, his expensive suit looking rumpled dark circles under his eyes. His lawyer had advised him not to attend, but the terms of Grandpa's arrangement required all beneficiaries to be present or forfeit any claim to the estate. Madison looked equally haggard, her usual perfect makeup unable to conceal the strain. Trevor was the only one who maintained any semblance of composure, though I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he took notes on his legal pad. Mrs. Chen placed envelope 2 on the table, the one labelled the money. Everyone leaned forward slightly, and I saw the hunger in their eyes despite everything that had been revealed. They still thought this envelope would save them, would give them the financial security they had been counting on. "Before I open this," Mrs. Chen said, "I want to remind everyone that Mr. Knight's arrangements were made with great care and legal precision. Nothing in these envelopes is accidental or arbitrary." She broke the seal and pulled out a thick folder of documents. The $12 million that has been referenced in family discussions is not a personal bank account. It is the Barbara Knight Memorial Fund, a 501c3 charitable trust established 15 years ago in honour of your grandmother. The silence that followed was profound. I saw a confusion ripple across my cousins' faces, followed quickly by comprehension and then horror. The fund was created to provide assistance to 2 specific populations. Mrs. Chen continued reading from the founding documents: single mothers escaping domestic abuse, who need emergency housing and financial support, and isolated elderly individuals who lack family support for medical care and basic needs. I felt tears prick my eyes. Grandma Barbara had died 16 years ago, and I remembered how deeply Grandpa had grieved her. She'd always been the compassionate one, the person who volunteered at shelters and brought meals to elderly neighbours. Of course, Grandpa would honour her memory this way. For 15 years, Mr. Knight contributed annually to this fund, Miss Chen said. He invested conservatively and managed it carefully. The current value is $12.3 million. The fund has been operating this entire time quietly, helping people in need. Your grandfather never sought recognition or publicity. He simply did the work because it mattered to him. "Wait," Trevor said, his voice sharp. "Are you saying there's no inheritance, that he gave away everything to charity?" "I'm saying the $12 million you've all been fighting over was never intended as personal inheritance," Mrs. Chen replied. "It was always designated for charitable purposes." "But Dad had other money," Madison said desperately. "The house, his personal accounts, investments." "We'll address those assets in envelope 3, Mrs. Chen said. "But there's more in this envelope you need to hear." She turned to a page marked with a yellow tab. "Within the fund's bylaws, there is a specific notation regarding debts. I'll read it exactly as written. Outstanding loans from Knight family members total $600,000. These loans were extended in good faith with the expectation of repayment. Per the trust bylaws, any unpaid debts must be settled in full before the fund can be officially transferred to its new director." "Who's the new director?" Brandon asked. Mrs. Chen glanced at me briefly before continuing. "That will be revealed in envelope 3, but first we need to address the debt repayment terms." She pulled out another document. "All family members who borrowed money from James Knight must repay their outstanding balances in full within 90 days of his death. This includes all loans, whether formally documented or made on verbal agreements." She laid out a spreadsheet that listed each cousin's name and their debt amount. Brandon owed $250,000 across various business loans. Madison owed $190,000, including the $30,000 she'd taken from what she'd thought was a family emergency fund, but was actually an initial charitable contribution Grandpa had been planning. Trevor owed $160,000 from what were described as investment opportunities that had never materialized. "What happens if we can't pay?" Trevor asked his lawyer, instincts kicking in despite his obvious shock. Mrs. Chen's expression remained neutral. "Failure to repay within the 90-day period will result in your names being published on the fund's public website as outstanding debtors with the full amount listed. Additionally, the trust reserves the right to pursue civil litigation to recover the funds, including potential liens on property and wage garnishment." "This is insane," Brandon said, his voice rising. "No one has $600,000 just sitting around. He's trying to bankrupt his own family. What kind of grandfather does this? The kind who watched his family forget he was a human being and start treating him like an A-team," I said quietly. Everyone turned to look at me, and I met their gazes steadily. The kind who gave and gave and gave and never got anything back except more demands. The kind who died with only one grandchild by his side because the rest of you were too busy calculating your inheritance to sit with him while he was dying. "You don't know what you're talking about," Madison said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I replied. "I was there. I was there every single day while you were at the bank pressuring Mrs. Chen trying to figure out how to get your hands on money that was never yours to begin with." Mrs. Chen cleared her throat gently. "Envelope 3 will provide additional clarity on Mr. Knight's intentions and his provisions for all of you. It will also explain the debt repayment terms in full detail, including the extension option." Brandon stood up so abruptly his chair fell backward. "Extension option? What extension option? Why didn't you mention that first?" "Because Miss Knight wanted you to understand the seriousness of your obligations before offering any alternatives." "Mrs. Chen said calmly, "Envelope 3 will answer all of your remaining questions, Mr. Knight. I suggest you sit down and prepare yourself to listen." Brandon picked up his chair and sat down slowly, his movements mechanical. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the desperate hope that this extension option might be his salvation. Madison had her hands clasped in her lap, knuckles white, while Trevor sat perfectly still, his pen hovering over his legal pad, but not writing anything. Mrs. Chen opened envelope 3 with the same careful precision she'd shown with the others. This envelope was thicker, and when she pulled out the contents, I saw several documents bound together with a blue legal backing. Attorney Miller leaned forward slightly, his professional interest clearly engaged. "This is Mr. James Robert Knight's last will and testament," Mrs. Chen announced, "executed on March 15th, 2022, 3 years before his death. Mr. Miller, would you confirm the document's authenticity?" Attorney. Miller accepted the will and examined it carefully, turning pages, checking signatures and seals. After a moment, he nodded. "I can confirm this is the will I notarized in my office 3 years ago. Mr. Knight was of sound mind as certified by Dr. Patricia Hendricks, his primary care physician whose evaluation is attached. The document was signed in the presence of 2 independent witnesses, neither of whom are beneficiaries or family members. This will supersede all previous versions and is legally binding." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Mrs. Chen began reading, her voice steady and clear. "I, James Robert Knight, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils." She paused, then continued. "After much consideration and observation of my family over many years, I make the following bequests." I watched my cousins lean forward, their attention absolute. "First, regarding the Barbara Knight Memorial Fund, currently valued at approximately $12 million. I hereby appoint my granddaughter Caroline Elizabeth Knight as Executive Director of this fund, with full authority over its operations, investments, and charitable distributions. She will receive an annual salary of $120,000 for her service in this capacity commensurate with the responsibilities of managing a fund of this size. I felt the air leave my lungs. Executive Director, me, of a $12 million charitable fund. Second, Mrs. Chen continued, I bequeathed to Caroline Elizabeth Knight a separate personal account containing $500,000. This money is for her own use to provide her with security and freedom to pursue whatever path brings her fulfillment. She has earned this through years of selfless caregiving and unwavering love. This is bullshit, Brandon muttered, but Mrs. Chen kept reading. Third, my family home at 847 Oakwood Drive shall become the permanent headquarters of the Barbara Knight Memorial Fund. Caroline may choose to live in the upstairs residence while maintaining the ground floor as office space, or she may arrange alternative housing as she sees fit. Our childhood home. The place where I'd spent countless afternoons with Grandpa learning to bake cookies, in his kitchen, reading in his study, listening to his stories on the back porch. It would become a place that helped people just like Grandma Barbara would have wanted. Fourth, I leave to Caroline all of my personal effects, including photographs, letters, books, and jewellery. Most importantly, I leave her my father's pocket watch, which has been in our family for 3 generations. Caroline understands the value of time and family in a way that makes her worthy of this heirloom. I remembered that watch. Grandpa had shown it to me when I was a teenager, explained how his father had carried it through World War II, had checked it every day to remember what he was fighting for, the time he'd have with his family when he came home. Mrs. Chen turned to the next page. Regarding debts owed to me by family members totaling $600,000. These debts must be repaid in full within 90 days of my death. However, I grant Caroline sole authority to extend this deadline by up to 60 additional days if she observes genuine remorse and meaningful behavioural change, not merely words, but actual demonstrated change in how these family members conduct themselves. So that was the extension option. Not automatic forgiveness, not even mercy extended by Grandpa himself, but a choice he'd placed entirely in my hands. The power to show grace or demand justice depending on what I witnessed in the weeks ahead. I make this provision, Mrs. Chen read, because I believe in the possibility of redemption, but I also believe redemption must be earned through action, not promised through empty apologies. Caroline has the wisdom and discernment to make this judgment. Trevor was scribbling furiously on his legal pad now. Madison had started crying again, though I couldn't tell if the tears were genuine or calculated. Brandon just stared at the table, his face unreadable. Finally, Mrs. Chen said, I recognise that Caroline may feel unprepared for the responsibility of managing such a large charitable fund. Therefore, I have arranged for a 3-person advisory board consisting of experienced non-profit professionals. Dr. Margaret Chen, former director of the Community Foundation. Thomas Blackwell, certified financial planner specialising in charitable trusts. And Reverend Sarah Martinez, who has 20 years of experience in social services. These advisors will provide guidance and support to Caroline for the first 2 years of the fund's operation under her leadership. Mrs. Chen set down the will and looked at me. Ms. Knight, do you accept these responsibilities as outlined in your grandfather's will? I couldn't speak. My throat was too tight, my eyes burning with tears I'd been holding back for weeks. Grandpa hadn't just left me money or property. He'd left me purpose. He'd left me the chance to continue his and Grandma's legacy of helping people who needed it most. He'd trusted me with something infinitely more valuable than a bank account. I managed to nod. Yes, I whispered. I accept. All 3 of my cousins turned to stare at me. Madison's face was streaked with tears. How could you do this to us? She asked, her voice breaking. We're family. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Trevor stood up, his expression cold and furious. This whole thing is unconscionable. I'll be filing a challenge to this will, to undue influence, lack of capacity, improper execution, There are a dozen grounds. Brandon just kept shaking his head, muttering under his breath. 600,000, 90 days. Extension if she decides. This is insane. I looked at each of them, these people I'd grown up with, whose childhood birthdays I remembered, whose faces I'd known my entire life. They'd become strangers. Or maybe they'd always been strangers, and I'd just been too naive to see it. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky. Mrs. Chen handed me a folder containing copies of all 3 envelopes and the will. I took it, held it against my chest like armour. Without saying a word to any of my cousins, I turned and walked out of the conference room. The siege began the morning after I left that conference room. I woke to find 17 missed calls on my phone, a dozen text messages, and 5 voicemails, all from my cousins, all demanding we talk, that we work this out as a family, that I reconsider what I was doing to them. I didn't respond to any of them. What could I possibly say? Grandpa had made his wishes clear. He'd given me a responsibility, and I intended to honour it. But my silence only seemed to fuel their desperation. Madison was the most persistent. She showed up at my apartment 3 times in the first 2 weeks, each visit more dramatic than the last. The 3rd time, she arrived at 7 in the morning, mascara already running down her face, pounding on my door hard enough that my neighbours peered out to see what the commotion was about. "Please, Caroline," she begged when I finally opened the door, if only to stop the noise. "I'm your cousin. We grew up together. Family helps family. My business is collapsing. I'm going to lose everything. You have $500,000 sitting in an account. You could help me and never even feel it. The debt repayment terms were Grandpa's decision, not mine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But you have the power to extend the deadline. That's what he wanted, for you to show mercy. What kind of person are you watching your own family suffer when you could help?" I closed the door without answering, my hands shaking. What she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I was suffering too. Every accusation, every plea, every attempt to make me feel guilty for honouring Grandpa's wishes was like a weight pressing down on my chest. Trevor took a different approach. He sent long, carefully worded emails that arrived every few days, each one a masterpiece of emotional manipulation disguised as reason. One 3-page message dissected what Grandpa would have really wanted, arguing that Grandpa had created the extension option because he knew the debts were unreasonable and expected me to use it. Another email focused on how money was dividing our family and how Grandma Barbara, with her kind heart, would never have wanted to see us torn apart like this. But it was Brandon who scared me the most. He stopped contacting me directly and instead hired an attorney who sent official legal correspondence to my apartment. The letters arrived on heavy letterhead, formal and threatening, alleging undue influence and elder abuse. They claimed I had manipulated Grandpa during his final months when he was mentally incompetent, that I'd isolated him from his family and convinced him to disinherit his other grandchildren. None of it was true. Dr. Hendrick's evaluation, conducted specifically for the will, proved Grandpa had been cognitively sharp until the very end. But the accusations themselves were damaging, planting seeds of doubt that could take root in people's minds. The rumours started in the 3rd month. I first became aware of them when an old colleague from my previous job mentioned something at a charity event I'd attended. "I heard you had some kind of complicated situation with your grandfather's estate," she said, her tone careful. "Someone said there were questions about whether everything was handled properly." My stomach dropped. "What did you hear exactly?" She looked uncomfortable. "Just that there were concerns about elder abuse, that maybe your grandfather wasn't in his right mind at the end. I'm sure it's not true, but you know how people talk." I did know. And over the next few weeks, I discovered just how far the whisper campaign had spread. Former acquaintances who'd always been friendly suddenly avoided eye contact. I overheard a conversation at the coffee shop near my office, where someone said my name followed by family inheritance dispute and took advantage of him. Then my boss called me into her office. Sarah Chen had always been supportive, understanding about the time I'd needed to care for Grandpa, flexible about my schedule as I transitioned into my new role with the charitable fund. But when I walked into her office that Tuesday afternoon, her expression was troubled. "Caroline, I received some concerning emails," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "Anonymous emails making allegations about financial impropriety. Claims that you've been embezzling from our organisation." The room seemed to tilt. "That's completely false. Sarah, you know me. You have access to all our financial records. Everything is documented and audited." "I know," she said quickly. "I've already reviewed everything, and obviously there's no truth to these claims. But I needed to address it with you directly. Do you have any idea who might be sending these emails?" I thought about my cousins, their desperation, the approaching debt deadline. "I have some ideas," I said quietly. That night, sitting alone in my apartment with the lights off, and the city sounds drifting up from the street below, I finally broke. The weight of everything. Grandpa's death, the revelation of my cousin's true nature, the constant pressure, the attacks on my reputation, the responsibility of managing a $12 million charitable fund came crashing down all at once. I curled up on my couch and cried until I had no tears left, until my ribs ached and my head pounded. Maybe Grandpa had asked too much of me. Maybe I wasn't strong enough for this. Maybe the easiest path was to just give them what they wanted, forgive the debt, split the $500,000 with them, and disappear. I could move to another city, start over somewhere no one knew my name or my story. I must have fallen asleep on the couch because I woke to the glow of my laptop screen across the room, the screensaver casting dancing shadows on the walls. I dragged myself over to close it and saw I had a new email notification. The sender was Linda Morrison. The subject line read, "About your grandfather. Please read." My finger hovered over the delete button, assuming it was another accusatory message or some distant relative I'd never met coming out of the woodwork to claim a piece of the estate. But something made me click it open. "Dear Caroline," it began. "My name is Linda Morrison, and I was your grandfather's nurse 10 years ago when he was hospitalised for heart surgery. I saw the announcement about the Barbara Knight Memorial Fund in the newspaper, and I've been following the situation. I have something important to tell you about your grandfather that I think you need to hear. Would you be willing to meet with me? I promise this will be worth your time." I stared at the email for a long moment, then typed back, "Tomorrow. Tell me where." So we met the next afternoon at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls where you could sit for hours without anyone bothering you. I arrived first and chose a table in the back corner, nursing a cup of coffee I didn't really want, when Linda Morrison walked in and I recognised her immediately, even though we'd never met. She had that particular bearing that long-time nurses develop a combination of warmth and efficiency, someone who's seen people at their most vulnerable and learned to hold their stories with care. She was 68, she told me in her follow-up email recently, retired after 45 years in nursing. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore a cardigan despite the mild weather. When she spotted me, her face softened with recognition. "Caroline," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "Thank you for meeting me. I know this must seem strange getting an email out of the blue from someone you've never heard of." "I'm grateful you reached out," I said honestly. "These past few months have been difficult." "I imagine they have." Linda ordered tea from the passing waitress, then turned her full attention to me. "I need to start by telling you who I am and how I knew your grandfather. 10 years ago, I was an ICU nurse at Memorial Hospital. Your grandfather was my patient after emergency heart surgery, triple bypass. He was in our unit for 45 days. 45 days. I tried to remember that time, but I'd been in my mid-20s, just starting my career, absorbed in my own life. I knew Grandpa had been sick, had surgery, but I hadn't understood how serious it was. I took care of him during the day shift," Linda continued. "And, Caroline, I need you to understand something. In all those 45 days, not one family member visited him. Not a one. The words hit me like a physical blow. No one, she shook her head slowly. He would ask us every day, have any of my children called? Did my grandchildren send a message? We had to keep telling him no. I watched a strong, proud man become smaller and sadder with each day that passed without anyone from his family showing up. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it was that serious. If I had... You were young, Linda said gently, and I suspect no one told you how bad it really was. But the others, his own children, they knew. The hospital sent notifications. We called the numbers he gave us. They were informed. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. I kept a copy of his patient care log. I probably shouldn't have, but something about his situation bothered me and I wanted to remember. I want you to see this. She opened the folder to show me pages of medical documentation. Grandpa's name at the top of each sheet, dates running from May through July of that year. In the section labelled Visitors, there was a notation for every single day, none. He would watch the door during visiting hours, Linda said quietly, every day watching and hoping, and every day no one came. I couldn't stop the tears now. They fell onto the table between us, and I didn't bother wiping them away. All this time I'd known my cousins were selfish and greedy, but I hadn't understood the depth of their neglect, hadn't realised how long this pattern had been going on. There's something else, Linda said. She pulled a small wooden box from her bag, about the size of a shoebox, and set it on the table between us. Before your grandfather was discharged, he gave me this. He said, Linda, I need you to keep this safe. If something happens to me if I die, and there's conflict in my family, I want you to give this to Caroline. Only Caroline. She'll need it. My hands trembled as I reached for the box. It was light, made of cedar with a small brass latch. I opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, old ones from when I was a child. Me and Grandpa at the park feeding ducks. Me on his shoulders at a parade. Me sitting in his lap while he read to me. Underneath the photos was a letter, the paper yellowed with age, my name written on the envelope in Grandpa's handwriting. I pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. The date at the top was from 10 years ago, shortly after his surgery. Dear Caroline, I read aloud, my voice shaking. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I hope Linda found you when you needed her. I'm writing this from my hospital bed, and I've had a lot of time to think about my family, about who shows up and who doesn't. You're the only one who called while I was here. Just once, but you called. You said you loved me, and you were sorry you couldn't visit because of work, but you'd come to see me as soon as I was home. That phone call meant more to me than you'll ever know. I had to stop reading for a moment, pressing my hand to my mouth to hold back a sob. I did remember that call now. I'd been between meetings, had 5 minutes, and had called the hospital to check on him. It had seemed like nothing at the time, just a quick conversation to let him know I was thinking of him. Don't let your kindness be taken advantage of, the letter continued. You have a generous heart, Caroline, and there will be people who try to use that against you. But remember, being kind doesn't mean letting others hurt you. It doesn't mean accepting injustice because it's easier than fighting. I'm prouder of you than anything else in my life. You're more like your grandmother than you know. Stay strong. Stay true. And know that whatever happens, I saw you. I always saw you. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box, unable to speak. Linda reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He told me something else that day, something that seemed odd at the time but makes sense now. He said there's a hidden drawer in his home office. 3rd drawer down in the oak desk. He said only you would know to check there because you'd remember. And he said you'd need what's inside when the time came. 3rd drawer. I suddenly remembered Grandpa's dying words, the ones I'd been too grief-stricken to fully process at the time. Drawer. 3rd. Camera. Truth. He also mentioned Linda added that his security cameras had caught everything over the years. He said, "The cameras remember what people want to forget." I looked up at her, understanding washing over me. Grandpa had documented everything, not just the video of Brandon and Trevor's conversation that Mrs. Chen had shown us, but everything. Years of neglect, of selfishness, of his family, treating him like an inconvenience. It was all recorded, all preserved. "I need to get back into his house," I said. I called Mrs. Chen from the cafe parking lot, my hands still shaking from reading Grandpa's letter. She answered on the second ring, her professional tone softening when she heard the urgency in my voice. "I need access to Grandpa's house," I said. "There are some personal items I need to retrieve before the conversion to the fund headquarters begins." There was a pause. "The property is currently in a transitional status. I'll need to arrange for a bank representative to accompany you as a witness per the estate protocols." "That's fine. When can we do this?" "I can have someone meet you there in an hour." 60 minutes felt like an eternity. I drove to Grandpa's house, that familiar route I'd taken hundreds of times over the past few years, and parked across the street. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. The blue shutters Grandma had insisted on, the rose bushes, along the front walk, the porch swing where Grandpa and I used to sit on summer evenings. But it felt different now, empty in a way that had nothing to do with whether anyone was inside. The bank representative arrived precisely on time, a young man in his 20s named David, who explained he was there merely to document what I removed from the property. He seemed nervous, probably aware of the family dispute surrounding the estate. I signed his clipboard and we went inside together. The moment I stepped through the front door, the grief I'd been holding at bay crashed over me. Everything was exactly as Grandpa had left it. His reading glasses on the side table next to his favourite chair, folded on top of the newspaper from the day before he went to the hospital. His slippers by the door. The throw blanket Grandma had knitted decades ago, still draped over the back of the couch. "Take your time," David said quietly, recognising my distress. He positioned himself near the entrance, far enough away to give me privacy, but close enough to maintain his witness role. I walked through the house slowly, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The kitchen where I'd made Grandpa's meals, measuring out portions according to his dietary restrictions. The bedroom where he'd taken his last breath, where I'd held his hand and promised him I'd be okay. Each room was a museum of memories, and I had to force myself to keep moving to focus on why I was here. The home office was at the back of the house, a small room with built-in bookshelves and a large oak desk positioned in front of the window overlooking the backyard. Grandpa's computer sat, silent and dark, on the desktop. File folders were still stacked neatly in their organizer, everything meticulously ordered just as he'd always kept it. I sat down in his desk chair and pulled open the third drawer down on the right side. It appeared to contain nothing but old tax returns and insurance documents, exactly what you'd expect to find in a desk drawer. But I remembered Linda's words, "hidden drawer." And I remembered Grandpa's gift, the brass key I'd been carrying with me since the day he died. I pulled the drawer out completely and set it on the desk. There, at the back of the drawer cavity, I could see a small keyhole in what should have been the solid wood backing. My heart racing, I pulled out the brass key and inserted it into the lock. It turned smoothly and I heard a soft click. A panel at the back of the drawer space swung open like a small door, revealing a hidden compartment about 12 inches deep. Inside were several manila folders and a small USB drive in a protective case. I pulled everything out carefully, aware that David was watching from across the room. The first folder contained photocopies of loan documents, including the forged application with Brandon's signature that Mrs. Chen had already shown us. But there were handwriting analysis reports here too, comparing Brandon's known signature to the forged one, highlighting the similarities that proved he'd been the forger. The second folder made my stomach turn. It was a transcript from a family meeting in 2020, typed up in Grandpa's meticulous style. The heading read, "Overheard Conversation September 15th, 2020, recorded by Home Security System." I scanned the contents and saw my cousins' names, saw them discussing how to divide Grandpa's assets, actually using phrases like, "when the old man finally dies," and making sure we each get our fair share. This was from 5 years ago, long before Grandpa got sick proof that their greed wasn't new, but had been festering for years. The third folder contained letters from an attorney I didn't recognise addressed to Grandpa and marked confidential. I opened the first one and felt my blood run cold. It was a warning letter explaining that Trevor had been making inquiries about obtaining guardianship over Grandpa, claiming diminished mental capacity. The lawyer had advised Grandpa to get a formal cognitive evaluation to protect himself, which he'd apparently done immediately. But it was the USB drive that drew my attention most. It was in a small plastic case and written on a label in Grandpa's handwriting were the words, "For Caroline the Truth." "I need to use the computer," I called to David. He nodded and I booted up Grandpa's old desktop, my fingers trembling as I inserted the USB drive. There was a single video file on it, dated 6 months before Grandpa died. I double-clicked it and the screen filled with Grandpa's face. He was sitting right here in this office, in this very chair. He looked tired but alert, his eyes focused and clear. He was wearing his favourite cardigan, the blue one with the worn elbows that he'd refused to let Grandma throw away. He looked directly at the camera, directly at me, and began to speak. "Caroline, sweetheart, if you're watching this, I'm gone, and I need you to know something about your family." Grandpa's voice filled the quiet office, and hearing it again after 5 months of silence nearly undid me. He cleared his throat softly, that familiar gesture he'd always made before saying something important. "If you're watching this, it means you found the hidden drawer, which means Linda found you and gave you the letter I left with her. I'm glad. I worried you might give up before you got this far, that the pressure from your cousins might break you down. But you're stronger than you know, sweetheart. You always have been." He paused, looking down at his hands folded on the desk, and when he looked back up, I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not bitterness, but a profound sadness that made my chest ache. "I need to tell you that I'm not angry at them, at Brandon, Madison, Trevor. I'm just sad, so deeply sad about what they've become, about the choices they've made. I gave them chances to change, Caroline. So many chances over so many years. Every time they asked for money, I hoped it would be the last time, that they'd finally stand on their own. Every time they disappointed me, I told myself maybe next time would be different." His voice grew softer, more introspective. "I heard what Brandon and Trevor said about me that night in my living room. I was upstairs, couldn't sleep, and I heard their voices. I came down and stood in the hallway, just out of sight, and listened to my own grandsons discuss how much longer they thought I'd live and how they'd challenge any will that didn't give them what they wanted. I went back to my room and cried for the first time since your grandmother died. I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to stifle the sob that wanted to escape. He'd heard it himself, had stood there alone in his own house, listening to people he'd loved and supported plot against him. I saw the forged signatures on those loan applications," he continued. "Brandon thought he was clever, but I'd been signing my name for 80 years. I knew what my signature looked like. And Madison's gambling, Trevor's ethics violations, all of it. I hired investigators not to spy on them, but because I needed to know the truth. I needed to understand if there was anything left in them worth saving." He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was firmer, more purposeful. "I didn't create this plan to punish them, Caroline. I did it to protect you and to protect what your grandmother and I built together. The Barbara Knight Memorial Fund was her dream. She used to say, 'James, we need to help people who have no one, because we know what it's like to struggle.' We both came from nothing, worked for everything we had, and now you're going to carry that dream forward. That's what matters. Not revenge, not punishment, but purpose." The camera was so close I could see the small details of his face, The liver spots on his temple, the deep lines around his eyes, the way his collar sat slightly crooked. All the small human details I'd taken for granted when he was alive. "Sweetheart, you don't have to forgive them," he said, and his voice took on a gentle firmness. "I want you to understand that. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who've hurt you, but you have the right to choose. The extension clause I put in the will. The power I gave you to show mercy if you see genuine change. That's not because I expect you to use it. It's because I trust your judgment completely. Whatever you decide, I support you. You were always the one who understood what really mattered. Not money, not status, not keeping up appearances. You understood that being present matters, that love is shown through action, not words." He smiled then, that warm, slightly lopsided smile I'd seen 1,000 times, and fresh tears streamed down my face. "I love you, Caroline. I loved you when you were a little girl bringing me drawings from school. I loved you when you were a teenager trying to figure out who you were. I loved you when you became the kind, capable woman you are today. You deserved better than how they treated you. You deserved a family that saw your value, that celebrated your kindness instead of taking it for granted." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Now I'm asking you to live the life you deserve. Don't let their bitterness poison your joy. Don't let their greed make you cynical. Make it beautiful, sweetheart. Make your life beautiful. Help people. Love freely. And know that wherever I am, I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you." He reached forward and the video ended abruptly as his hand covered the camera lens. The screen went black and I was left staring at my own reflection in the dark monitor. I don't know how long I sat there before my legs gave out and I slid from the chair onto the floor, my back against the desk, and finally, truly, completely broke down. These weren't the controlled tears I'd shed at the funeral, or the quiet grief I'd carried through the long nights of caregiving. This was 5 months of suppressed emotion pouring out, all at once, grief and love and rage and exhaustion, and something else I couldn't quite name. David appeared in the doorway, concern on his young face. "Ms. Knight, are you okay? Do you need me to call someone?" I shook my head, unable to speak, and he retreated respectfully. I cried until my ribs hurt, until my throat was raw, until there was nothing left inside me but a strange, hollow clarity. Grandpa hadn't been angry. He'd been heartbroken, and he'd trusted me to be strong enough to carry forward without letting that heartbreak turn into bitterness. He trusted me to choose mercy or justice based on what I observed, not on what he demanded. He'd trusted me, period. Slowly something shifted inside me. Through all the tears and pain, I felt it settling into place, a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. I wasn't the invisible granddaughter anymore, the one who existed on the periphery of family gatherings. I was the inheritor of a legacy, the keeper of a dream, the person Grandpa had believed in when no one else had. I wiped my eyes, took a shaky breath, and stood up. I gathered the folders and USB drive from the desk, carefully placing them in my bag, along with Grandpa's reading glasses and a few framed photos I wanted to keep. David completed his documentation, noting that I'd removed personal memorabilia and family photographs, without itemizing the specific contents. I thanked him for his discretion, and he gave me a small, understanding nod before locking the house behind us. For 3 days, I didn't answer my phone. I didn't respond to emails or text messages. I took personal time from work and stayed in my apartment, reading and rereading Grandpa's letter, reviewing the documents from the hidden drawer, and watching his video message over and over until I'd memorized every word, every pause, every flicker of emotion across his face. I thought about everything with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've cried yourself empty. Did my cousins truly regret their actions? No. They regretted the consequences, regretted being caught, regretted that their schemes had failed, but they didn't regret how they treated Grandpa, didn't regret abandoning him when he needed them most. Every contact they'd made with me in the past 5 months had been about money, about what they'd lose, never about what they'd say done wrong. What would Grandpa want me to do? The question haunted me until I finally understood the answer he wanted me to choose freely. He'd given me power not to manipulate me into showing mercy, but because he trusted my judgment. He'd said it clearly in the video, whatever I decided would be the right decision, because it would be mine. And what did I want? I wanted to honour Grandpa's wishes. I wanted to live with dignity. I wanted to move forward without the weight of their bitterness dragging me down. But I also wanted them to face real consequences for their actions, to understand that love isn't something you can neglect for years and then demand on your terms. On the third day, I sent a group text to Brandon, Madison, and Trevor, please meet me at my apartment tomorrow at 2 p.m. We need to discuss the estate. They arrived exactly on time, and I could see the hope written plainly across their faces. Madison had even brought flowers, white lilies wrapped in cellophane, as if this were some kind of peace offering that would make everything better. Brandon wore a suit, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betraying a desperate optimism. Trevor carried his briefcase, probably filled with legal arguments he'd prepared, but his posture was less rigid than usual, as if he too thought this meeting might bring the reprieve they'd been praying for. I let them into my small apartment and gestured to the couch and chairs I'd arranged in the living room. I remained standing, needing the physical advantage of height, needing to feel grounded and strong. Thank you for coming. I began, my voice steady. I've spent the past several weeks thinking very carefully about Grandpa's will, about the debt repayment terms, and about the extension power he gave me. I saw Madison lean forward, hopefully, saw Brandon's shoulders relax slightly. I want you to understand that I've reviewed everything. The investigation reports, the security footage, all the documentation of what you've done over the years. I paused, making sure they understood I knew the full truth. I've thought about what Grandpa would want, and I've thought about what's fair. Caroline? Madison started, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. I've decided that I will not reduce or forgive any of the debts you owe. The amounts Grandpa documented are what you need to repay. The hope drained from their faces, replaced by dawning shock and anger. However, I continued, I will use the extension power Grandpa granted me. Instead of 90 days, you'll have 150 days total to repay what you owe. That's an extra 60 days, enough time for you to liquidate assets, arrange financing, and handle this yourselves. That's it, Brandon said, his voice tight. An extra 2 months. That's your idea of mercy. It's what Grandpa authorized me to provide, I said calmly, and it's more than you deserve given everything I've learnt about how you treated him. Madison's face crumpled and she started crying, but this time I recognized the tears for what they were manipulation last-ditch attempts to make me feel guilty. How can you do this to us? We're family. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Family doesn't mean accepting injustice. I said the words coming easier than I'd expected. Family doesn't mean staying silent while you're disrespected and taken advantage of. Grandpa gave me this choice. I'm making it based on what I've observed over the past 5 months. None of you have shown genuine remorse. You've only shown fear of consequences. Brandon shot to his feet, his face flushed dark red. You heartless bitch, you're forgetting your own blood. We grew up together. We're the only family you have, and you're going to throw us away over money. I'm not throwing you away, I said quietly. You threw Grandpa away years ago. You threw away every chance he gave you to be better. This isn't about money, it's about character. And I'm not going to apologize for having standards. Trevor stood too, his lawyer persona sliding back into place. This isn't over, Caroline. I'll file a motion to review your exercise of the extension. Power argue that you're violating the spirit of your grandfather's intent. The spirit of his intent, I interrupted, was to give me discretion, which I've used. You have 150 days. I suggest you spend that time repaying your debts instead of wasting money on lawyers. Brandon moved toward me, his finger jabbing the air between us. You're going to regret this when you're sitting alone in that big house with your precious charity fund and you realize you've destroyed your entire family. You're going to wish you'd made a different choice. I walked past him to my apartment door and opened it wide. The afternoon light from the hallway spilled into my living room, and I stood in it feeling stronger than I'd felt in months. "Please leave," I said. Madison gathered her flowers, clutching them like a shield. Trevor picked up his briefcase. They filed out one by one, not looking at me. Brandon was the last to go, pausing in the doorway, as if he might say something else. But when he met my eyes, whatever he saw there made him think better of it. He left without another word. I closed the door behind them, locked it and leaned against it, listening to their footsteps fade down the hallway. My hands were shaking, but it was a different kind of trembling than before, not fear or uncertainty, but the aftermath of adrenaline, of finally standing up for myself after a lifetime of staying quiet. I'd done it. I'd made my choice. And whatever happened next, I could live with it. I heard about Brandon first. The news came through a former colleague who'd seen the listing for his investment properties, both going to auction at prices far below market value. "Fire sale," she'd said sympathetically, "must be in some kind of trouble." I didn't tell her I knew exactly what kind of trouble. But the real blow to Brandon came from the criminal case. The district attorney's office had moved forward with the forgery charges, and Brandon's lawyer had negotiated a plea deal to avoid trial. The terms were public record full restitution to First National Bank, 200 hours of community service, and 2 years of probation. If he violated any terms, he'd face up to 3 years in prison. I saw him once during this period coming out of the courthouse on the day he entered his plea. He'd lost weight, his expensive suit hanging loose on his frame. A woman in her late 20s was with him, Emma, I realised. His daughter. The one he'd supposedly borrowed money for college but had gambled away instead. She looked angry and ashamed, walking 3 steps behind her father, and when a local reporter tried to ask her a question, Brandon snapped, "She has nothing to say," in a voice I'd never heard him use before. Defeated. Broken. Madison's downfall was more public and somehow more painful to witness. The first spa closed in month 6, a handwritten sign on the door, thanking customers for their patronage. Then the second, then the third. I heard from someone at the nonprofit that Madison had laid off 30 employees, total many of them single mothers who'd depended on those jobs. The house went on the market in month 7. I drove by it once, saw the realtor's sign, saw Madison's car in the driveway loaded with boxes. She'd bought that house 5 years ago, had thrown a massive housewarming party, and invited everyone she knew. Now she was moving into a 1-bedroom apartment across town, the kind of place she would have turned her nose up at before. The community gossip was vicious. I'd overhear conversations at the grocery store, at the coffee shop. "Did you hear about Madison Knight? Gambling problem, I heard. Lost everything. Always knew there was something off about her." Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Country club membership quietly revoked. Invitations stopped coming. Trevor's career implosion was perhaps the most devastating because his identity had been so completely tied to being a successful attorney. The state bar suspended his license for 18 months while they completed their investigation into the client trust fund allegations. Without a license, he couldn't practice law. The best job he could find was as a paralegal at a small firm, making a quarter of his former salary, doing grunt work for lawyers younger and less experienced than him. I ran into his former secretary at a charity event. "It's sad," she said quietly. "He comes in every day, in his suit, tries to maintain his dignity, but you can see it eating him alive. He has to ask permission to use the copy machine. Him, Trevor Knight. He'd managed to scrape together the $150,000 he owed by liquidating his retirement accounts, taking the tax penalties, selling his boat and his luxury car. He'd repaid Grandpa's debt, but had nothing left. At 42 years old, he was starting over from ground zero. Through all of this, I maintained my silence. I didn't gloat, didn't comment, didn't engage. I focused on the fund, working with the advisory board to establish grant criteria, set up administrative systems, and plan the official launch. Grandpa's house was being transformed, the main floor converted into office space, while the upstairs remained as modest living quarters I could use if needed. Then, 2 weeks before the 150-day deadline, Madison appeared at the construction site. I was meeting with the contractor about the accessibility ramp when I saw her walking up the driveway. She looked like nothing like the polished, confident woman who'd brought flowers to my apartment months ago. Her hair needed cutting, her clothes were department store basics, and there were deep lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Caroline," she said, "please, I need to talk to you." I excused myself from the contractor and stood on the front porch where we'd played as children, where Grandpa used to serve us lemonade on hot summer days. She climbed the steps slowly, as if each one required effort. "I know you don't want to hear from me," she began, "but I'm desperate. I've sold everything. I've closed the businesses, lost my house, and I still can't make the full payment by the deadline. I'm short by $40,000. She dropped to her knees right there on the porch, her hands clasped like she was praying. "Please, Caroline, I'm begging you. Can't you help me just this once? I'm your cousin. We're family." I looked down at her, this person who'd spent years making me feel small and worthless, who'd called me pathetic and boring, who'd spread rumours about me stealing from Grandpa. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity, not anger. Just a calm, clear certainty about what needed to happen next. "Madison," I said quietly, "do you remember 5 years ago at Christmas? You told everyone at dinner that I was pathetic for not having a real career, that working for a non-profit was basically volunteering, and that I'd never amount to anything." Her face went white. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. "I'm not helping you," I said. "Not out of revenge, not because I'm cruel, but because this is a lesson you need to learn. Actions have consequences. The way you treated people, the way you treated Grandpa, the choices you made, they all led here. And I'm not going to save you from learning what you need to learn." I turned and walked back to where the contractor was waiting, leaving Madison kneeling on the porch behind me. The deadline came and went with the finality of a door closing. Brandon and Madison had both failed to repay their full debts, and per Grandpa's instructions, their names appeared on the Barbara Knight Memorial Fund website under a section titled Outstanding Obligations. The amounts were listed clearly, along with a statement that civil litigation was being pursued. Mrs. Chen had handled it all with professional efficiency, and I'd signed the necessary documents without hesitation. What I didn't expect was the silence from Trevor. Unlike Brandon, who'd sent increasingly hostile emails, threatening lawsuits, and calling me every name he could think of, or Madison, who'd alternated between begging and accusing me of enjoying her suffering, Trevor simply went quiet. No calls, no texts, no dramatic confrontations. I heard through the community grapevine that he'd sold his Mercedes and was driving a 10-year-old Honda, that his boat had gone to auction, that he'd liquidated his entire investment portfolio, taking substantial tax penalties to make his payment before the deadline. And then, nothing. For 3 months, I heard nothing from him at all. The fund headquarters was nearly complete when he finally appeared. I was in what had been Grandpa's living room, now converted into a welcoming reception area, reviewing furniture catalogues, with Susan, the administrative assistant I'd hired, when the door opened and Trevor walked in. He looked different, thinner, grey, showing at his temples that he'd apparently stopped dying. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt. No expensive suit, no polished lawyer armour. His hands were empty, no briefcase, no documents, no aggressive posture. "Caroline," he said, "do you have a few minutes?" Susan glanced at me, her hand hovering near the phone in case I needed her to call someone. I nodded to her that it was okay, and she discreetly left the room. Trevor stood there, making no move to sit down. "I don't expect forgiveness," he began, his voice quiet. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know that I went to visit Dad's grave yesterday. I sat there for 2 hours and told him everything I did wrong, how I talked about him like he was an inconvenience, how I tried to figure out ways to access his money without his permission, how I stood in his living room and discussed contesting his will before he was even gone. His voice broke slightly on the last word. I don't know if he heard me. I don't know if it matters, but I needed to say it out loud. I stayed quiet, watching him carefully for signs of manipulation, for the calculated emotions I'd learned to recognise in Madison's performances. But Trevor's shame seemed genuine, his discomfort real. My daughter, Sophia, is 8 years old, he continued. Last week she found a photo album at my ex-wife's house. There were pictures of Dad, of all of us, at family gatherings when she was little. She asked me, Daddy, why didn't you visit Grandpa James when he was sick? And I couldn't answer her, Caroline. I just stood there and I had nothing to say. He looked at me directly for the first time since he'd walked in. That's when it hit me. I'm teaching her to become like me. I'm showing her through my actions that family doesn't matter, that money matters more than people, that it's okay to use people and discard them when they're no longer useful. And I don't want that. I don't want her to grow up thinking that's what family means. I leaned against Grandpa's old reading chair, now reupholstered, but still in its place by the window. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know that at least one person understands how badly we failed, he said. Not just failed Dad, but failed ourselves, failed to be decent human beings. Do you want me to say it's okay? I asked. That you're forgiven because you feel bad now? No, he said immediately. I don't deserve forgiveness. I'm just trying to be honest about what I did and who I was. And I'm trying to change, not because I think it'll get me anything, but because I need to look at myself in the mirror and see someone my daughter can be proud of. We stood in silence for a long moment. Outside, I could hear the construction crew working on the accessibility ramp, the whine of power tools and the thump of hammers. The house was becoming something new, something that would help people instead of just holding old grief. Thank you for telling me, I said finally. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't acceptance, but it was acknowledgement. Trevor nodded once and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. The fund is a good thing, Caroline. Dad would be proud of what you're building here. Then he was gone, and I was left standing in the transformed living room trying to process what had just happened. Susan returned a moment later, her expression curious. That was unexpected, she said carefully. Yes? I agreed. It was. Do you think he meant it about changing? I thought about the question, about the difference between regret at being caught and genuine remorse about whether people could actually transform or if they just got better at hiding who they really were. I don't know, I said honestly. But maybe. If he keeps it up, if he proves through actions, not just words, then maybe someday. 2 weeks later, an email appeared in my inbox. The subject line read, volunteer application. The message was brief and formal. Dear Caroline, I've submitted a volunteer application for the Barbara Knight Memorial Fund. I saw on the website that you're looking for people to help with outreach and administrative support. I'm not asking for special treatment or consideration. I just want to be useful to do something meaningful with my time. This isn't about making up for what I did. I know I can't. It's about actually changing who I am. No expectations of forgiveness or reconciliation. Just an offer to help, if you'll allow it. Trevor. I stared at the email for a long time, my finger hovering over the delete button. Then I forwarded it to Margaret Chen, the advisory board member, who was heading up our volunteer program with a single note. Please review and decide on merit alone. Don't give any special consideration, positive or negative, based on family connection. Because if Trevor was serious about changing, he needed to prove it through sustained action, not grand gestures. And if he wasn't serious, time would reveal that truth too. Either way, it was no longer my burden to carry. The Barbara Knight Memorial Fund officially opened its doors on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 10 months after Grandpa's death. The transformation of his house was complete. the main floor now a welcoming space with comfortable seating, private interview rooms, and a small library of resources. Grandma's rose garden in the back had been restored with a bench placed under the oak tree, where Grandpa used to sit and read. I'd hired 5 staff members carefully interviewing dozens of candidates before finding people who understood that this work wasn't about building a resume or earning recognition. Maria handled intake, her background as a social worker, making her perfect for meeting people at their most vulnerable. James managed finances, and Grant's his decades of nonprofit accounting experience, invaluable. The others, Rebecca, David, and Kim, each brought their own expertise in case management, community outreach, and volunteer coordination. The advisory board met with me weekly those first months, guiding decisions about everything from grant criteria to office procedures. Margaret Chen, with her 30 years running the Community Foundation, had become something of a mentor, teaching me how to balance compassion with sustainability, how to help without enabling, how to maintain boundaries while staying human. Our mission was simple but comprehensive: emergency housing for single mothers, escaping domestic violence, medical care, stipends for isolated elderly who lacked family support, and scholarships for orphaned children. In our first month alone, we helped 47 families. 47 real people with real problems who walked into Grandpa's house desperate and left with hope. I was at my desk reviewing grant applications when Maria knocked on my doorframe. "Caroline, there's a woman here who'd like to speak with you specifically. She says she knew your grandfather." My heart did a small flip at those words. I'd been bracing myself for more angry cousins or distant relatives, appearing with their hands out, but when I walked into the reception area, I found a tiny, elderly woman with white hair and warm brown eyes sitting in one of the comfortable chairs, a worn purse clutched in her lap. "Ms. Knight," she stood with effort, leaning on a cane. "I'm Dorothy Patterson. I saw the announcement in the paper about the fund opening, and I just had to come." We sat together in one of the private interview rooms, and she explained that she needed help with medical bills, that her prescription costs were eating up her entire Social Security check. Standard intake for us, nothing unusual. But as I took notes on her situation, she kept looking around the room with tears in her eyes. "This is such a beautiful thing you're doing," she said. "Your grandfather would be so proud." "Did you know him?" I asked gently. "Oh, yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He saved my life 20 years ago. I'd just lost my husband, my Tom, to a heart attack. No life insurance, no savings, and I was about to lose my apartment. I was 75 years old, with nowhere to go." She wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "One day there was a knock on my door. It was your grandfather. He said he'd heard about my situation through his church, though I later learnt he didn't even go to that church regularly. He handed me an envelope with enough cash to cover 3 months of rent." I felt something catch in my throat. "He did," she nodded. "He said, 'Everyone deserves kindness when they're struggling, Mrs. Patterson. No one should face hard times alone.'" I tried to thank him, tried to find a way to pay him back, but he wouldn't hear of it, said the only payment he wanted was for me to help someone else someday when I was able. "I never knew," I said quietly. "He never mentioned it." "That was his way," Miss Patterson said. "He helped my neighbour's grandson with college tuition, never told a soul. He paid for Mrs. Chen down the street to get her furnace fixed one winter. He was always doing things like that, quiet things, never wanting recognition." She looked at me with such kindness. "You're just like him, you know. I can see it in how you've set up this place, how your staff treats people. You're carrying on what he believed in." After I'd arranged for Mrs. Patterson's medical expenses to be covered, and she'd left with Rebecca to complete the paperwork, I stood in the reception area looking at the photos on the wall. Pictures of Grandma and Grandpa through the years, their wedding photo, the two of them at various charity events. In every image, they looked genuinely happy, their smiles reaching their eyes. Margaret found me there a few minutes later. "You okay?" "I just realised something," I said. Grandpa didn't just leave me money. He didn't just give me this house and a salary and a mission statement. He left me a legacy that was already decades old. He'd been doing this work his whole life, just quietly, one person at a time. And now you're amplifying it, Margaret said, turning what he did individually into something systematic, something sustainable. That's not replacing his legacy, it's honouring it and expanding it. I thought about the 47 families we'd helped in 1 month, about Mrs. Patterson, who'd been carrying gratitude for 20 years, about all the people Grandpa had touched without ever seeking credit or recognition. He'd understood something my cousins never had, that the point of having resources wasn't to accumulate more resources, but to use them to make other people's lives easier. That night, I stayed late at the office, walking through the quiet rooms after everyone had gone home. I ended up in Grandpa's former study, now my office, sitting in his chair and looking out at the garden, where the last roses of autumn were still blooming. I understand now, I said aloud to the empty room. This was never about the money. It was about continuing what you and Grandma started. About making sure kindness doesn't die when people do. The house settled around me with small creaks and sighs, and I imagined I could feel Grandpa's presence, satisfied and at peace. Not because his grandchildren had been punished or because justice had been served, but because the work he cared about was continuing growing, reaching more people than he could have helped alone. I wasn't just managing a fund. I was carrying forward a lifetime of quiet compassion. And for the first time since his death, I felt truly connected to him, not through grief or anger or the bitter inheritance battles, but through purpose. The invitation arrived in my email on a Monday morning, formal and unexpected. The Regional Nonprofit Leaders Conference was asking me to be a keynote speaker at their annual gala. We'd love to hear about the Barbara Knight Memorial Fund's successful first year and your journey in nonprofit leadership, the program director had written. My first instinct was to decline. The thought of standing in front of hundreds of nonprofit professionals, many with decades more experience than me, made my stomach clench with anxiety. But Margaret, when I showed her the email, looked at me with that knowing expression that meant she was about to push me outside my comfort zone. This is exactly the kind of visibility the fund needs, she said. And frankly, Caroline, people need to hear your story. Not just the fund's success metrics, but the human story behind it. So I said yes and spent the next 3 weeks terrified, rewriting my speech dozens of times, practicing in front of my bathroom mirror, until I could recite it without my voice shaking. The gala was held at the Grand Hotel downtown, a glittering affair with chandeliers and round tables, draped in white linen. I sat at the head table in a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, watching the room fill with people I recognised from news articles and non-profit boards. When the programme director introduced me, listing my credentials and the fund's accomplishments, I heard the words but barely recognised them as describing me. I walked to the podium on legs that felt disconnected from my body, looked out at the sea of expectant faces, and took a breath. Almost a year ago, I began. My grandfather died, and in the months that followed, I learned some hard truths about family, about love, and about what really matters in life. I told them about Grandpa's final months, about being his sole caregiver, though I didn't name my cousins or detail their specific failures. I talked about discovering that family isn't defined by shared DNA, but by who stands beside you when you need them most. I learnt that lesson the hard way. I said, my voice growing steadier as I found my rhythm. I learned that being kind doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, that having boundaries doesn't make you selfish, it makes you strong. And I learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing harm, it's about refusing to let bitterness poison your future. I talked about Mrs. Patterson, about discovering Grandpa's decades of quiet generosity, about how the fund was really just making visible and systematic what he'd been doing individually all along. The hardest thing I had to learn, I said, looking directly at the audience now, instead of my notes, was that I was worthy of being chosen. My grandfather chose me not because I was perfect, but because I showed up, because I cared, because I understood that love is demonstrated through presence and action, not through demands or expectations. And once I understood that I was worthy of his trust, I finally understood that I was worthy of my own trust too. The applause when I finished was thunderous, but what mattered more were the faces I saw, people wiping their eyes, nodding in recognition, seeing their own experiences reflected in mine. Afterward, during the reception, a woman in her mid-50s approached me. She had the look of someone who'd recently cried, her makeup slightly smudged, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I need to thank you," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Your story, what you said about boundaries and self-worth. I've been struggling with my own family situation for years. They take and make me feel guilty for not giving more. I thought I was being selfish, for wanting to step back, for wanting to protect myself." She grabbed my hand, holding it tightly. "You showed me I'm not selfish. I'm protecting myself. That's not the same thing." "It's not," I agreed, squeezing her hand back. "And you deserve to be protected, especially by yourself." She left and others came, each with their own story of toxic family dynamics, of learning to set boundaries, of choosing themselves even when it felt impossible. I realised my story wasn't just mine. It was a story that resonated with so many people who'd been taught that family obligation meant accepting mistreatment. That night, back in my apartment, still in my gala dress, I opened my laptop and stared at the blank document for a long time. Then I began typing. "Dear Grandpa, it's been almost a year since you left. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like a lifetime ago." The words poured out everything I'd been holding inside, everything I wished I could tell him directly. I wrote about the fund's success, about the families we'd helped, about Mrs. Patterson and her 20-year-old gratitude. I wrote about Trevor's slow, steady efforts to change, about how I was learning to recognise genuine transformation versus performance. I wrote about finding my own strength, about learning that his trust in me wasn't a burden, but a gift, about understanding that he'd always seen me clearly, even when I couldn't see myself. "You gave me more than money or property," I typed. "You gave me purpose. You showed me that love isn't loud or demanding. It's quiet and consistent. It's showing up day after day, even when no one notices, especially when no one notices." I wrote about the speech I'd given, about the woman who'd thanked me, about realising that healing from family trauma wasn't just my journey, but something I could help others with by being honest about my experience. "I miss you every day," I wrote at the end, "but I'm not drowning in grief anymore. I'm building something beautiful from what you left behind. I hope that wherever you are, you can see it. I hope you're proud." I saved the document as "For Grandpa Doc" and closed my laptop. The letter would never be sent, would never be read by anyone but me. But writing it had given me something I needed, a way to have the conversation I'd never get to have in life, a way to acknowledge everything that had changed in me since that night in the hospital, when he'd squeezed my hand one last time. The healing wasn't complete, maybe it never would be, but I was no longer the invisible granddaughter who accepted crumbs of attention and convinced herself it was enough. I was someone who knew her worth, who honoured the trust placed in her, who understood that some legacies are measured not in dollars, but in lives touched. And that understanding, more than anything else Grandpa had left me, was the greatest inheritance of all. I woke on the anniversary knowing exactly how I wanted to spend the day. The fund office could manage without me for a few hours. I'd printed the letter I'd written after the gala, folded it carefully, and tucked it into my purse, along with fresh flowers from the farmer's market, white roses, Grandpa's favourite. The cemetery was quiet on a Tuesday morning, the November air crisp and clean. I found Grandpa's grave easily, having visited several times over the past year, though never as frequently as I'd intended. His headstone was simple granite, exactly as he'd specified in his arrangements. James Robert Knight, beloved husband, father, grandfather, he helped people. I knelt and placed the roses in the built-in vase. then sat back on the grass, not caring that it was slightly damp from morning dew. I pulled out the letter and unfolded it, my hand steadier than I'd expected. "Grandpa, it's been a year," I began, reading aloud, my voice carrying across the empty cemetery. "I miss you every day. Some mornings I still reach for my phone to call you before I remember you're gone, but the missing has changed. Somehow it's not as sharp, not as overwhelming. It's just there, a permanent ache that I've learned to carry." I told him about the fund, about the 213 families we'd helped so far, about Mrs. Patterson and discovering his decades of quiet generosity, about the speech I'd given and the woman who'd thanked me for helping her understand the difference between selfishness and self-protection. "About the family," I continued, my voice catching slightly. "I did what you taught me. I didn't accept injustice, but I didn't become cruel either. I set boundaries. I kept them. Brandon and Madison are still dealing with the consequences of their choices, and I've stopped feeling guilty about that. It's not my job to save people from themselves." I paused, looking at the engraved letters of his name. "Trevor is genuinely trying to change. He's been volunteering at the fund for 5 months now. He shows up on time, does whatever needs doing, never complains about grunt work. He's teaching his daughter about accountability and making amends. I think you'd be happy about that. I think you always believed people could change if they really wanted to." The wind rustled through the trees overhead, scattering the last autumn leaves across the cemetery grounds. "I've let go of my anger," I read. "Not for them, for me, because carrying that rage was exhausting and it wasn't changing anything. I've learned that I have a real family now, Grandpa. The people at the fund, the advisory board, even some of the families we've helped who stay in touch. They see me. They value me. That's what family actually means." I finished reading and sat in silence, the letter resting in my lap. A year ago, I'd been sitting in his hospital room, holding his hand through his final breaths, having no idea what was coming. Now, here I was, having survived the battle, having built something meaningful from his trust in me. "I kept my promise," I whispered. "I didn't let them break me." "He knew you wouldn't." I startled and turned to find Linda Morrison, standing a few feet away, leaning on her cane. She smiled gently. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I come here once a month to visit him. He was one of the special ones, you know. In 45 years of nursing, I met a lot of patients, but very few like James Knight." "Linda," I said, standing and brushing grass from my pants. "I didn't expect to see anyone here." "The anniversary," she said, moving to stand beside me. "I thought you might come today." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the headstone. "He left something else for you. I was instructed to give it to you after 1 year had passed." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" She reached into her large purse and pulled out a small wooden box similar to the one she'd given me 10 months ago, but slightly larger. "He gave me this the same day he gave me that first box. He said if Caroline makes it through the first year, without giving up, if she builds what I'm asking her to build, give her this. She'll have earned it." With trembling hands, I took the box from her. It was heavier than I expected, made of polished walnut with a small brass clasp. I opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was a pocket watch. Not just any pocket watch, I recognized it immediately. Grandpa had shown it to me once when I was a teenager, had told me the story of how it had survived World War II in his father's pockets, how his father had checked it every day to remind himself what he was fighting for. Beneath the watch was another letter, the paper slightly yellowed, dated 3 years ago, the same time he'd set everything else in motion. I picked up the letter with shaking hands and began to read, Linda standing quietly beside me. "My dearest Caroline, if you're reading this, you've made it through the hardest year. I'm so proud of you, prouder than I can express in words. You stood up for yourself. You honoured what your grandmother and I believed in. You didn't let bitterness turn you into someone you're not." Tears were already streaming down my face, but I kept reading. "This watch belonged to my father, who carried it through the war and gave it to me when I was 25 years old. He said, 'Son, Time is our most precious gift. Give it to people who deserve it. Now I give it to you, Caroline, because you understand the value of time better than anyone I know. You gave me your time when I needed it most. You gave 2 years of your life to making sure I wasn't alone. That gift was worth more than any amount of money. My vision blurred and I had to stop reading to wipe my eyes. Linda rested a gentle hand on my shoulder. "There's more," she said softly. I took a shaky breath and continued. "Wear this watch and remember you are worthy of love, of respect, of all good things. You always were. I'm sorry it took me leaving for you to fully believe that. Live beautifully, my dear girl. Help people, love freely, and know that wherever I am, I'm watching you with more pride than you can imagine. Love always, Grandpa." I closed the letter and looked at the watch, lifting it from its velvet bed. It was heavy and warm in my palm, the brass case worn smooth by 3 generations of handling. Linda smiled. "He wanted you to have something that proved you were carrying on a legacy, not just following instructions. That watch has been passed down when people earned it, not when they were entitled to it." I fastened the watch chain to my belt loop, the way I remembered Grandpa wearing it, and felt its comfortable weight against my hip. It wasn't just a watch. It was proof that I'd survived, that I'd become someone worthy of the trust placed in me. "Thank you," I managed to say to Linda, "for everything, for keeping his secrets, for bringing me these gifts when I needed them." "It was my honor," she said. She glanced at her own watch, a simple digital one, and smiled. "I have another visit to make. You take your time here." After she left, I sat back down next to Grandpa's grave, one hand resting on the pocket watch. The metal was warming to my body temperature, becoming part of me. "I'll wear it well," I promised the headstone. "I'll remember what it means." The November sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the cemetery, and for just a moment I could have sworn I felt Grandpa's hand rest on my shoulder the way he used to when I was a child and needed reassurance. "I love you too," I whispered. Then I touched the top of his headstone one last time and walked back to my car. There was work to do, people to help, a legacy to continue. And now I had 3 generations of timekeepers with me, reminding me what truly mattered. I was gathering my things, preparing to leave the cemetery, when Linda called out to me. "Caroline, wait. There's one more thing." I turned back to find her reaching into her purse again. "Your grandfather was very thorough in his planning. When he gave me these boxes, he also gave me this." She pulled out a printed document, several pages stapled together. "It's a confirmation from a service called futureme.org. Do you know it?" I shook my head, moving back to where she stood. "It's a website that lets you schedule emails to be sent in the future," Linda explained. "Your grandfather used it 3 years ago to write 10 letters, 1 for each of your next 10 birthdays. They're all scheduled to send automatically." The words didn't make sense at first. I stared at the confirmation page she was showing me, saw the list of dates stretching from next month through the next decade. 10 emails, 10 more messages from Grandpa waiting in some digital queue to arrive on the exact days I'd need them most. "He wrote them all in one sitting," Linda said, her voice gentle. "Spent an entire afternoon at his computer composing each one. He told me he wanted to make sure you weren't alone on your birthdays, that you'd have something from him to remind you that you're loved." "But I'll be 36 next month," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He planned this for when I'm 45. "He wanted to be part of your life for as long as he could arrange," Linda said. She handed me another paper, this one a printed copy of the first scheduled email. "He gave me a copy of this one, said I could share it with you after you received the watch so you'd know what to expect." My hands trembled as I took the paper. The top showed my email address and it said she scheduled send date exactly 1 month away, my 36th birthday. Below that was the message itself. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," it began, and I had to press my hand over my mouth to hold back a sob. "I know I'm not there to celebrate with you, but I want you to know I'm so proud of the woman you've become. By now, the fund should be helping many families, and I hope you're finding joy in the work. Remember what I always told you: you don't have to be perfect, you just have to be present. You've always been so good at showing up for people. The letter went on recounting a specific memory from my childhood, my 11th birthday, when it had rained and ruined my planned party, and how Grandpa had transformed the living room into an indoor carnival with games he'd made from cardboard boxes and string. You were disappointed at first, but then you helped me build the games, and by the time your friends arrived, you were laughing so hard you could barely breathe. That's who you are, Caroline. Someone who finds joy, even when plans fall apart. He ended with, I hope this year brings you everything you deserve. Take care of yourself, help people, and know that I'm always with you, even when you can't see me. Love, Grandpa. I couldn't hold it back anymore. I sank down onto the grass next to Grandpa's headstone and cried the way I hadn't allowed myself to cry at his funeral, the way I'd been too numb to cry in the immediate aftermath. These weren't tears of grief or loss, they were tears of overwhelming love of recognition that even in death, Grandpa was still taking care of me, still thinking about the moments when I'd need to hear his voice. Linda sat down beside me with some difficulty, her cane propped against Grandpa's headstone, and put her arm around my shoulders. He loved you so much, honey, so very much. He spent hours on these letters, revising them until they were perfect. He wanted each one to feel like he was really there with you. 10 years, I managed between sobs. He gave me 10 more years with him. He gave you whatever he could, Linda said. That's what love does. It finds a way to stay even after everything else is gone. We sat there together for a long time, Linda holding me while I cried out a year's worth of holding myself together, of being strong, of making impossible decisions. When the tears finally subsided, I felt emptied out, but also somehow fuller, as if Grandpa's love had filled all the hollow places his death had left behind. I stood and helped Linda to her feet, then looked down at the pocket watch now hanging at my hip. I unclipped it and opened the case, seeing the Roman numerals on the face, the delicate hand still keeping perfect time after all these decades. Inside the case, someone had engraved a single word, present. Be present. That was what the watch was really about. Not just measuring time, but being fully in each moment, giving your attention to what and who matters. I closed the case and fastened it back to my belt loop, feeling its weight settle against me like a promise, like an anchor, like 3 generations of love made tangible. Thank you, Grandpa, I whispered to the headstone, for everything, for seeing me, for trusting me, for loving me enough to stay in every way you could. I'll make you proud. I promise I'll make you proud. Linda squeezed my hand. You already have, dear. You already have. The fund's 2nd anniversary gala was everything the first year's modest celebration hadn't been. We'd rented the ballroom at the Grand Hotel, the same place where I'd given my speech a year ago. 500 guests filled the space, donors, community leaders, families we'd helped, and volunteers who'd become the heart of our operation. I stood near the entrance greeting arrivals, wearing the pocket watch openly now attached to a chain that hung from my jacket. It had become my signature piece, something people in the non-profit community recognised. That's Caroline Knight, I'd overhear them say, the one with her grandfather's watch. The past year had been transformative for the fund. We'd helped over 500 families, expanded to 3 satellite offices in neighbouring communities, and received the State Nonprofit Association's Emerging Leader Award. Just last month, I'd been named Young Philanthropist of the Year, an honour that had made me think of Grandpa and wish he could have been there to see it. Trevor was here tonight, arriving early, as he always did, helping coordinate the volunteer greeters. 18 months of showing up every Saturday, of doing unglamorous work without complaint, of slowly rebuilding his life with genuine humility. His law licence had been reinstated 3 months ago, and he'd opened a small practice focused on pro bono family law, helping people navigate guardianship and estate issues. He'd repaid his debt in full, and then, without fanfare, donated an additional $50,000 to the fund. I'd allowed him back into my life carefully, gradually. Not as family, that word still carried too much painful history, but as someone earning trust through sustained action. We had coffee occasionally. He updated me on his daughter Sophia, now 10 years old, who, he said, asked about cousin Caroline and the fund. I wasn't ready for that relationship yet, but I appreciated that he wasn't pushing. Brandon and Madison were conspicuously absent, as they had been keen from every fund event. They'd eventually paid their debts after the civil litigation moved forward, but there'd been no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Last I'd heard, Brandon had left the state, starting over somewhere in Arizona. Madison was working as a receptionist at a dental office, her spa empire reduced to memory. They blamed me for their circumstances, or so I'd been told. I'd made peace with that. Some people never learn, never change, never take responsibility. I couldn't carry their bitterness for them. I was talking with Dr. Margaret Chen about our plans for a 4th satellite office when I saw a young woman hovering near the registration table, clearly wanting to approach, but hesitant. She was in her late 20s, dressed professionally, but not expensively, with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Something about her face seemed familiar, though I couldn't place it. Finally, she gathered her courage and walked over. "Miss Knight," her voice was soft, uncertain. "I'm Emma. I'm Brandon's daughter." The noise of the gala seemed to fade away. Brandon's daughter. The Emma he'd mentioned, the one he'd supposedly saved money for but had actually gambled away. The one who'd been at the courthouse when he'd entered his plea deal looking angry and ashamed. "I know this is strange," Emma continued quickly, her words tumbling out. "And I know what my father did to you. I know about the forgery, the estate battle, all of it. He and I don't speak anymore. I can't..." She paused, collecting herself. "I can't be around someone who lies like that and won't take responsibility." I studied her face, saw the resemblance to Brandon around the eyes, but also something different, something softer. She met my gaze directly, no manipulation in her expression, just honest vulnerability. "I'm not like him," she said. "I work as a social worker at a domestic violence shelter. I've read about your fund, about what you're doing, and I want to help. I want to volunteer. I want to be part of something good." She took a shaky breath. "I know you have every reason to say no. I'm asking anyway." Margaret had quietly stepped away, giving us privacy. Around us, the gala continued laughter, conversation, the clink of glasses. But in this small bubble, it was just Emma and me, and a decision that would reveal whether I truly learned what Grandpa tried to teach me. I looked at her and saw not Brandon's daughter, but a young woman trying to break free from toxic family patterns, trying to forge her own path, trying to be better than the example she'd been given. I saw someone who could have stayed silent, stayed away, but had chosen to show up despite the risk of rejection. I saw, in other words, a younger version of myself. "Tell me about yourself," I said, my voice gentle. "About your work at the shelter, about why this matters to you." I paused, then smiled. "And tell me when you can start." The relief that washed over Emma's face was so profound I thought she might cry. "Really? You'd actually let me volunteer?" "I judge people by their own actions, not their family's failures," I said, touching the pocket watch at my hip. "My grandfather taught me that. So, yes, really, let's talk." Emma and I talked for nearly 30 minutes, standing in a quiet corner of the ballroom while the gala swelled around us. She told me about her degree in social work, about the shelter where she'd worked for 3 years, about the moment she'd realised her father's version of events didn't match reality. She'd done her own research, found the court records, read the investigation reports that were part of the public record. She'd chosen to distance herself from Brandon, not because I'd asked her to, but because she couldn't respect who he'd become. "I want to be the kind of person my great-grandfather was," she'd said, "not the kind of person my father turned out to be." Now, as I stood at the podium, waiting for the room to quiet down for my speech, I could see Emma at one of the volunteer tables, helping distribute programs with a genuine smile on her face. She'd stepped into the work immediately, naturally, as if she'd always been meant to be here. The ballroom was packed with 500 people donors who believed in our mission community leaders, who'd supported our expansion families we'd helped, who'd returned to celebrate with us. The round tables were covered in white linens, centerpieces made of white roses in honor of Grandpa and Grandma Barbara. The lighting was warm and golden, making everything feel hopeful and alive. My eyes found Linda Morrison in the front row, her silver hair gleaming under the lights, her face radiating the kind of pride that only comes from watching someone you've invested in succeed. Next to her sat Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who'd been helped by Grandpa 20 years ago, and by our fund a year ago, both lifelines thrown across time. At the registration table near the back, Trevor coordinated the volunteer team with quiet efficiency, his transformation from entitled lawyer to humble servant, complete enough that people who'd known him before barely recognised who he'd become. And there, in the front row centre, was an empty chair. We'd placed it there deliberately, a small placard resting on the seat in memory of James Robert Knight, founder's inspiration. Some people might think it was morbid or overly sentimental, but I thought Grandpa would have appreciated the gesture being present, even in absence his values occupying space, even when his body couldn't. The room settled into expectant silence. I touched the pocket watch at my hip, feeling its familiar weight, drawing strength from 3 generations of Knight men who'd understood what mattered. 2 years ago, tonight, I began my voice steady and clear. My grandfather passed away. In the months that followed, I learned things about family, about love, about inheritance that I never expected to learn. I paused, scanning the faces turned toward me. He left me more than money, more than property, more than a $12 million charitable fund. He left me a lesson about what truly matters in life. I could see people leaning forward, drawn into the intimacy of the moment despite the large crowd. He taught me that your value isn't determined by people who can't see it. You can be invisible to your family, dismissed by people who should cherish you, overlooked by those who should celebrate you, and you can still be valuable. Because value isn't assigned by others. You create your own value through how you treat people, through what you build with your life, through the choices you make when no one is watching. Linda was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Several other people in the audience were doing the same. My grandfather was invisible to most of his family in his final years, I continued. They saw him as a bank account, as an inheritance to be divided as an obstacle between them and financial security. But he was so much more than that. He was a man who quietly helped people for decades, who paid rent for widows, who covered medical bills for struggling families, who gave without needing recognition or gratitude. I gestured to the room around us. This fund is my attempt to make visible what he did in secret, to take his individual acts of kindness and turn them into systematic, sustainable help for people who need it most. In 2 years, we've helped over 500 families, 500 stories of struggle that turned into stories of hope because of the foundation he built and trusted me to expand. The audience was absolutely silent now, hanging on every word. But here's what I really learned. I said, my voice growing stronger. I learned that being kind doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. That setting boundaries doesn't make you selfish, it makes you strong. That real family isn't defined by DNA or legal relationships, but by who shows up, who stays, who loves you, not for what you can give them, but for who you are. I looked directly at the empty chair, feeling Grandpa's presence as surely as if he were sitting there watching me. I learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing harm. It's about refusing to let bitterness poison the beauty you're trying to create. And I learned that legacy isn't what you leave behind when you die. It's what you inspire others to build after you're gone. My hand rested on the watch again unconsciously, seeking its comfort. This fund isn't just my grandfather's legacy. I said, my voice thick with emotion but not breaking. It's a legacy for all of us, for everyone in this room who believes that kindness deserves to be honoured, that caring for others is never weakness, and that real family is built on love, not obligation. It's a legacy for the single mothers we help find safe housing, for the elderly people we ensure aren't forgotten, for the children we give educational opportunities. And yes, it's a legacy for those of us who've learnt that sometimes the family we choose is more real than the family we were born into. The standing ovation began before I'd even finished my last sentence, building like a wave from the front row backward. People were on their feet, applauding, some crying openly. I stood at the podium, overwhelmed by the response, by the visible proof that Grandpa's values had multiplied and spread far beyond what he'd done alone. I looked up at the ornate ceiling of the ballroom, blinking back tears, and whispered words I knew no one else could hear over the applause. Grandpa, I kept my promise, and I finally found my family. As the ovation continued, I stepped away from the podium and made my way into the crowd. Emma was there immediately, her eyes shining. "That was beautiful," she said. "Thank you for giving me a chance to be part of this." "Thank you for having the courage to ask," I replied. We walked together through the ballroom, and everywhere I turned, I saw faces I'd come to love. Mrs. Patterson grabbed my hand as I passed her table, squeezing it tightly. "He's so proud of you, dear. Wherever he is, he's so proud." Maria, our intake coordinator, was crying happy tears at her table with other staff members. Dr. Margaret Chen raised her wine glass to me from across the room, her smile saying everything words couldn't. Trevor approached as I neared the registration table, maintaining his respectful distance, but wanting to acknowledge the moment. "That was the truth," he said simply. "Everything you said about real family. I'm grateful you've let me earn my way toward being part of yours." "Keep showing up," I said. "That's all anyone has to do." Linda Morrison was the last person I stopped to see before returning to the front of the room. She stood with some difficulty leaning on her cane and pulled me into a hug that smelled like lavender and old books. "He knew," she whispered in my ear. "When he gave me those boxes, when he recorded that video, when he planned all of this, he knew you'd do exactly this. He knew you'd turn grief into purpose, pain into compassion. He knew you were the one who understood." I miss him. I said the words simple but complete. "Of course you do," Linda said. "Love doesn't end just because life does. You carry him with you every day. I can see it in how you move through the world." The gala continued around us, music starting up, people moving to the dance floor, laughter and conversation filling the elegant space. But I needed one more moment, one more private ritual to complete the evening. I walked to the empty chair in the front row, the one we'd reserved for Grandpa. The placard rested on the seat, his name printed in elegant script. I reached out and placed my hand on the chair's armrest, feeling the cool wood under my palm. Then I lifted my other hand, the one wearing the 3-generation watch, and rested it beside the placard. "We did it," I whispered. "We built something beautiful from what you left behind. We helped people. We chose kindness. We created family from love instead of obligation." I paused, taking in the joy-filled room around me. "And I'm not invisible anymore, Grandpa. Not to the people who matter. Not to myself." I stood there a moment longer, my hand on the watch connecting me to my great-grandfather's war, to my grandfather's life, to my own future. 3 generations of understanding that time is precious, that presence matters, that love is shown through action. Then, I smiled, touched the empty chair one last time, and turned back to the celebration, to Emma learning volunteer procedures, to Trevor coordinating with quiet competence, to Linda and Mrs. Patterson, laughing together, to 500 people who'd come together because they believed in what Grandpa had believed in. I was no longer the invisible granddaughter who accepted crumbs and called it love. I was Caroline Elizabeth Knight, Executive Director of the Barbara Knight Memorial Fund Keeper of 3 generations of legacy, and architect of my own chosen family. And I was exactly where I was meant to be. And that's where Caroline's story brings us today. 2 years after losing her grandfather, she transformed from the invisible family member into a woman who'd helped over 500 families find hope. She took $12 million her cousins fought over and turned it into something that actually mattered, a living legacy that fed children, housed abused mothers, and cared for forgotten elderly people. Brandon ended up in Arizona with nothing, still blaming everyone but himself. Madison works as a receptionist, now her spa empire gone bitter about consequences she brought on herself. They paid their debts but never learned the real lesson, that the inheritance they lost wasn't money, it was the chance to be part of something meaningful. Trevor actually changed. 18 months of showing up, proving through action that he understood what he'd lost. He rebuilt his practice, helping people instead of using them. Caroline let him back into her life slowly, as someone who'd earned trust through sustained effort. And Emma, Brandon's daughter, became proof that chains can be broken, that you don't have to become what your parents were. She volunteered at the fund every weekend, learning how to build something good from difficult circumstances. Here's the most beautiful part. 10 times over the next 8 years on Caroline's birthday, an email will arrive from her grandfather, 10 letters he wrote before he died, scheduled automatically reminding her she's loved and worthy. He found a way to stay with her even after death. That pocket watch Caroline wears, it's a reminder that time is precious and we should only give it to people who deserve it. Her grandfather gave her his time, his trust, his belief in her worth. She's spending her life giving that same gift to families who need someone to believe in them. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of toxic family situations, or inspired you to set boundaries, leave a comment below. Tell me your story about the person who saw your value when no one else did, or about choosing yourself over family obligation, or about the legacy you're building from disappointment. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week, we bring stories like Caroline's people who refused to stay invisible, who chose dignity over approval, who built beautiful lives from painful circumstances. Stories proving you don't have to accept mistreatment just because it comes from family. Your value isn't determined by people who can't see it. You create it through the choices you make and the life you build. Caroline kept her promise. She honoured his trust. She found her real family people who showed up, who stayed, who loved her for who she was. What promise are you keeping? What legacy are you building? Share your story in the comments. Until next time, remember, showing up matters, presence matters, and you matter whether anyone else recognises it or not.